Chapter 9, Sections 4 and 5 of A Modern Utopia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. Chapter 9, Sections 4 and 5. "I follow the common rule, as many men do," said my double, answering my allusion to his uniform almost apologetically. "But my own work is, in its nature, poetic. There is much dissatisfaction with our isolation of criminals upon islands, and I am analyzing the psychology of prison officials, and criminals in general, with a view to some better scheme. I am supposed to be ingenious with expedients in this direction. Typically, the samurai are engaged in administrative work. Practically, the whole of the responsible rule of the world is in their hands. All our head teachers and disciplinary heads of colleges, our judges, barristers, employers of labor beyond a certain limit, practicing medical men, legislators, must be samurai, and all the executive committees, and so forth, that play so large a part in our affairs, are drawn by lot exclusively from them. The order is not hereditary. We know just enough of biology and the uncertainties of inheritance to know how silly that would be, and it does not require an early consecration or novitiate or ceremonies and initiations of that sort. The samurai are in fact volunteers. Any intelligent adult in a reasonably healthy and efficient state may, at any age after 25, become one of the samurai and take a hand in the universal control. Provided he follows the rule. Precisely, provided he follows the rule. I've heard the phrase voluntary nobility. Well, that was the idea of our founders. They made a noble and privileged order, open to the whole world. No one could complain of an unjust exclusion, for the only thing that could exclude from the order was unwillingness or inability to follow the rule. But the rule might easily have been made exclusive of special lineages and races. That wasn't their intention. The rule was planned to exclude the dull, to be unattractive to the base, and to direct and coordinate all sound citizens of good intent. And it succeeded? As well as anything finite can. Life is still imperfect, still a thick felt of dissatisfaction and perplexing problems, but most certainly the quality of all its problems has been raised, and there has been no war, no grinding poverty, not half the disease, and an enormous increase of the order, beauty, and resources of life since the samurai, who began as a private aggressive cult, won their way to the rule of the world. I would like to have that history, I said. I expect there was fighting? He nodded. But first, tell me about the rule. The rule aims to exclude the dull and base altogether, to discipline the impulses and emotions, to develop a moral habit and sustain a man in periods of stress, fatigue, and temptation, to produce the maximum cooperation of all men of good intent, and in fact to keep all the samurai in a state of moral and bodily health and efficiency. It does as much of this as well as it can, but of course, like all general propositions, it does not do it in any case with absolute precision. On the whole, it is so good that most men who, like myself, are doing poetic work, and who would be just as well off without obedience, find a satisfaction in adhesion. At first, in the military days, it was a trifle hard and uncompromising. It had rather too strong an appeal to the moral prig and harshly righteous man, but it has undergone, and still undergoes, revision and expansion, and every year it becomes a little better adapted to the need of a general rule of life that all men may try to follow. We now have a whole literature, with many very fine things in it, written about the rule. He glanced at a little book on his desk, took it up as if to show it to me, then put it down again. The rule consists of 3 parts. There is the list of things that qualify, the list of things that must not be done, and the list of things that must be done. Qualification exacts a little exertion as evidence of good faith, and it is designed to weed out the duller dull and many of the base. Our schooling period ends now about 14, and a small number of boys and girls, about 3%, are set aside then as unteachable, as in fact nearly idiotic. The rest go on to college or upper school. All your population? With that exception. Free? Of course. and they pass out of college at 18. There are several different college courses, but one or other must be followed, and a satisfactory examination passed at the end. Perhaps 10% fail, and the rule requires that the candidate for the samurai must have passed. But a very good man is sometimes an idle schoolboy. We admit that, and so anyone who has failed to pass the college leaving examination may at any time in his later life sit for it again, and again, and again. Certain carefully specified things excuse it altogether. Well, that makes it fair, but aren't there people who cannot pass examinations? People of nervous instability, but they may be the people of great though irregular poetic gifts. Exactly. That is quite possible. But we don't want that sort of people among our samurai. Passing an examination is a proof of a certain steadiness of purpose, a certain self-control and submission, of a certain ordinariness. Exactly what is wanted. Of course, those others can follow other careers. Yes, that's what we want them to do. And besides these two educational qualifications, there are others of a similar kind of more debatable value. One is practically not in operation now. Our founders put it that a candidate for the samurai must possess what they call a technique, and, as it operated in the beginning, he had to hold the qualification for a doctor, for a lawyer, for a military officer, or an engineer, or teacher, or have painted acceptable pictures, or written a book, or something of that sort. He had, in fact, as people say, to be something, or to have done something. It was a regulation of vague intention even in the beginning, and it became Catholic to the pitch of absurdity. To play a violin skillfully has been accepted as sufficient for this qualification. There may have been a reason in the past for this provision. In those days there were many daughters of prosperous parents, and even some sons, who did nothing whatever but idle uninterestingly in the world, and the organization might have suffered by their invasion, but that reason is gone now, and the requirement remains a merely ceremonial requirement. But, on the other hand, another has developed. Our founders made a collection of several volumes, which they called collectively the Book of the Samurai, a compilation of articles and extracts, poems and prose pieces, which were supposed to embody the idea of the order. It was to play the part for the samurai that the Bible did for the ancient Hebrews. To tell you the truth, the stuff was of very unequal merit. There was a lot of very second-rate rhetoric, and some nearly namby-pamby verse. There were also included some very obscure verse and prose that had the trick of seeming wise. But, for all such defects, much of the book, from the very beginning, was splendid and inspiring matter. From that time to this, the Book of the Samurai has been under revision. Much has been added, much rejected, and some deliberately rewritten. Now there's hardly anything in it that is not beautiful and perfect in form. The whole range of noble emotions finds expression there, and all the guiding ideas of our modern state. We have recently omitted some terse criticism of its contents by a man named Henley. Old Henley! A man who died a little time ago. I knew that man on Earth, and he was in Utopia too. He was a great red-faced man with fiery hair, a noisy, intolerant maker of enemies, with a tender heart. And he was one of the samurai? He defied the rules. He was a great man with wine. He wrote like wine. In our world he wrote wine, red wine with the light shining through. He was on the committee that revised our canon. For the revising and bracing of our canon is work for poetic as well as kinetic men. You knew him in your world? I wish I had, but I have seen him. On Earth he wrote a thing. It would run, "Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul." We have that here. All good earthly things are in Utopia also. We put that in the canon almost as soon as he died, said my double. Section 5. We have now a double canon, a very fine first canon, and a second canon of work by living men and work of inferior quality, and a satisfactory knowledge of both of these is the fourth intellectual qualification for the samurai. It must keep a sort of uniformity in your tone of thought. The canon pervades our whole world. As a matter of fact, very much of it is read and learnt in the schools. Next to the intellectual qualifications come the physical. The man must be in sound health, free from certain foul, avoidable, and demoralizing diseases, and in good training. We reject men who are fat, or thin, and flabby, or whose nerves are shaky. We refer them back to training. And finally, the man or woman must be fully adult. 21? But you said 25. The age has varied. At first it was 25 or over, then the minimum became 25 for men and 21 for women. Now there is a feeling that it ought to be raised. We don't want to take advantage of mere boy and girl emotions. Men of my way of thinking at any rate don't. We want to get our samurai with experiences, with a settled, mature conviction. Our hygiene and regimen are rapidly pushing back old age and death, and keeping men hale and hearty to 80 and more. There's no need to hurry the young. Let them have a chance of wine, love, and song. Let them feel the bite of full-bodied desire and know what devils they have to reckon with. But there is a certain fine sort of youth that knows the desirability of better things at 19. They may keep the rule at any time, without its privileges. But a man who breaks the rule after his adult adhesion at 25 is no more in the samurai forever. Before that age, he is free to break it and repent. And now, what is forbidden? We forbid a good deal. Many small pleasures do no great harm, but we think it well to forbid them nonetheless, so that we can weed out the self-indulgent. We think that a constant resistance to little seductions is good for a man's quality. At any rate, it shows that a man is prepared to pay something for his honor and privileges. We prescribe a regimen of food, forbid tobacco, wine, or any alcoholic drink, all narcotic drugs. Meat? In all the round world of Utopia there is no meat. There used to be, but now we cannot stand the thought of slaughterhouses. And in a population that is all educated, and about the same level of physical refinement, it is practically impossible to find anyone who will hew a dead ox or pig. We never settled the hygienic question of meat eating at all. This other aspect decided us. I can still remember, as a boy, the rejoicings over the closings of the last slaughterhouse. You eat fish? It isn't a matter of logic. In our barbaric past, horrible flayed carcasses of brutes dripping blood were hung for sale in the public streets. He shrugged his shoulders. They do that still in London, in my world, I said. He looked again at my laxer, coarser face, and did not say whatever thought had passed across his mind. Originally, the samurai were forbidden usury, that is to say, the lending of money at fixed rates of interest. They are still under that interdiction, but since our commercial code practically prevents usury altogether, and our law will not recognize contracts for interest upon private accommodation loans to unprosperous borrowers, it is now scarcely necessary. The idea of a man growing richer by mere inaction and at the expense of an impoverishing debtor is profoundly distasteful to utopian ideas, and our state insists pretty effectually now upon the participation of the lender in the borrower's risks. This, however, is only one part of a series of limitations of the same character. It is felt that to buy simply in order to sell again brings out many unsocial human qualities. It makes a man seek to enhance profits and falsify values, and so the samurai are forbidden to buy, to sell on their own account, or for any employer save the state, unless some process of manufacture changes the nature of the commodity. A mere change in bulk or packaging does not suffice, and they are forbidden salesmanship and all its arts. Consequently, they cannot be hotel keepers, or hotel proprietors, or hotel shareholders, and a doctor, all practicing doctors must be samurai, cannot sell drugs except as a public servant of the municipality of the state. Well, that, of course, runs counter to all our current terrestrial ideas, I said. We are obsessed by the power of money. These rules will work out as a vow of moderate poverty, and if your samurai are an order of poor men, they need not be. Samurai who have invented, organized, and developed new industries have become rich men, and many men who have grown rich by brilliant and original trading have subsequently become samurai. But these are exceptional cases. The bulk of your money-making business must be confined to men who are not samurai. You must have a class of rich, powerful outsiders. Have we? I don't see the evidences of them. As a matter of fact, we have such people. There are rich traders, men who have made discoveries in the economy of distribution, or who have called attention by intelligent, truthful advertisement to the possibilities of neglected commodities, for example. But aren't they in power? Why should they be? Wealth is power. I had to explain that phrase. He protested. Wealth, he said, is no sort of power at all unless you make it one. If it is so in your world, it is so by inadvertency. Wealth is a state-made thing, a convention, the most artificial of powers. You can, by subtle statesmanship, contrive what it shall buy and what it shall not. In your world, it would seem you have made leisure, movement, any sort of freedom, life itself, purchasable. The more fools you! A poor working man with you is a man in discomfort and fear. No wonder your rich have power. But here, reasonable leisure, a decent life, is to be had by every man on easier terms than by selling himself to the rich. And rich as men are here, there is no private fortune in the whole world that is more than a little thing beside the wealth of the state. The samurai control the state and the wealth of the state, and by their vows they may not avail themselves of any of the coarser pleasures wealth can still buy. Where, then, is the power of your wealthy man? But then, where is the incentive? Oh, a man gets things for himself with wealth, no end of things, but little or no power over his fellows, unless they are exceptionally weak or self-indulgent persons. I reflected. What else may not the samurai do? Acting, singing, or reciting are forbidden them, though they may lecture authoritatively or debate. But professional mimicry is not only held to be undignified in a man or woman, but to weaken and corrupt the soul. The mind becomes foolishly dependent on applause, over-skillful in producing tawdry and momentary illusions of excellence. It is our experience that actors and actresses are a class of loud, ignoble, and insincere. If they have not such flamboyant qualities, then they are tepid and ineffectual players. Nor may the samurai do personal services, except in the matter of medicine or surgery. They may not be barbers, for example, nor inn-waiters, nor boot-cleaners. But nowadays we have scarcely any barbers or boot-cleaners. Men do these things for themselves. Nor may a man under the rule be any man's servant, pledged to do whatever he is told. He may neither be a servant nor keep one. He must shave and dress and serve himself, carry his own food from the helper's place to the table, redd his sleeping room, and leave it clean. That is all easy enough in a world as order as yours. I suppose no samurai may bet? Absolutely not. He may insure his life and his old age for the better equipment of his children, or for certain other specified ends, but that is all his dealings with chance. And he is also forbidden to play games in public, or to watch them being played. Certain dangerous and hardy sports and exercises are prescribed for him, but not competitive sports between man and man or side and side. That lesson was learned long ago before the coming of the samurai. Gentlemen of honor, according to the old standards, rode horses, raced chariots, fought, and played competitive games of skill, and the dull, cowardly, and base came in thousands to admire and howl and bet. The gentleman of honor degenerated fast enough into a sort of athletic prostitute, with all the defects, all the vanity, trickery, and self-assertion of the common actor, and with even less intelligence. Our founders made no peace with this organization of public sports. They did not spend their lives to secure for all men and women on earth freedom, health, and leisure, in order that they might waste lives in such folly. We have those abuses, I said, but some of our earthly games have a fine side. There is a game called cricket. It is a fine, generous game. Our boys play that, and men too, but it is thought rather puerile to give very much time to it. Men should have graver interests. It was undignified and unpleasant for the samurai to play conspicuously ill, and impossible for them to play so constantly as to keep hand and eye in training against the man who was fool enough and cheap enough to become an expert. Cricket, tennis, fives, billiards, you will find clubs and a class of men to play all these things in Utopia, but not the samurai. And they must play their games as games, not as displays. The price of a privacy for playing cricket, so that they could charge for admission, would be overwhelmingly high. Negroes are often very clever at cricket. For a time, most of the samurai had their sword play, but few do those exercises now, and until about 50 years ago they went out for military training, a fortnight in every year, marching long distances, sleeping in the open, carrying provisions, and sham-fighting over unfamiliar ground dotted with disappearing targets. There was a curious inability in our world to realize that war was really over for good and all. And now, I said, haven't we got very nearly to the end of your prohibitions? You have forbidden alcohol, drugs, smoking, betting, and usury, games, trade, servants. But isn't there a vow of chastity? That is a rule for your earthly orders? Yes, except if I remember correctly, for Plato's guardians. There is a rule of chastity here, but not of celibacy. We know quite clearly that civilization is an artificial arrangement, and that all the physical and emotional instincts of man are too strong, and his natural instinct of restraint too weak for him to live easily in the civilized state. Civilizations have developed far more rapidly than man has modified. Under the unnatural perfection of security, liberty, and abundance our civilization has attained, the normal, untrained human being is disposed to excess in almost every direction. He tends to eat too much and too elaborately, to drink too much, to become lazy faster than his work can be reduced, to waste his interest upon displays, and to make love too much and too elaborately. He gets out of training and concentrates upon egoistic or erotic broodings. The past history of our race is very largely a history of social collapse due to demoralization by indulgences following security and abundance. In the time of our founders, the signs of a worldwide epoch of prosperity and relaxation were plentiful. Both sexes drifted toward sexual excesses, the men toward sentimental extravagances, imbecile devotions, and the complication and refinement of physical indulgences. The women towards those expansions and differentiations of feelings that find expression in music and costly and distinguished dress. Both sexes became unstable and promiscuous. The whole world seemed disposed to do exactly the same thing with its sexual interest as it had done with its appetite for food and drink. Make the most of it. He paused. Satiety came to help you, I said. Destruction may come before satiety. Our founders organized motives from all sorts of sources, but I think the chief force to give men self-control is pride. Pride may not be the noblest thing in the soul, but it is the best king there, for all that. They looked at it to keep a man clean and sound and sane. In this matter, as in all matters of natural desire, they held no appetite must be glutted, no appetite must have artificial whets, and also, and equally, that no appetite should be starved. A man must come from the table satisfied, but not replete, and in the matter of love, a straight and clean desire for a clean and straight fellow creature was our founders' ideal. They enjoined marriage between equals as the samurai's duty to the race, and they framed directions of the precisest sort to prevent that uxorious inseparableness, that connubiality which will reduce a couple of people to something jointly less than either. That canon is too long to tell you now. A man under the rule who loves a woman who does not follow it must either leave the samurai to marry her, or induce her to accept what is called the woman's rule, which, while it accepts her from the severe qualifications and disciplines, brings her regimen of life into a working harmony with his. Suppose she breaks the rule afterward. He must leave either her or the order. There is matter for a novel or so on that. There has been matter for hundreds. Is the woman's rule a sumptuary law as well as a regimen? I mean, may she dress as she pleases? Not a bit of it, said my double. Every woman who could command money used it, we found, to make underbred aggressions on other women. As men emerged to civilization, women seemed going back to savagery, to paint and feathers. But the samurai, both men and women, and the women under the lesser rule also, all have a particular dress. No difference is made between women under either the great or the lesser rule. You've seen the men's dress, always like this I wear. The women may wear the same, either with the hair cut short or plaited behind them, or they may have a high-waisted dress of very fine, soft woolen material, with their hair coiled up behind. I've seen it, I said. Indeed, nearly all the women had seemed to be wearing variants of that simple formula. It seems to me a very beautiful dress. The other... I'm not used to it. But I like it on girls and slender women. I had a thought and added, don't they sometimes, take a good deal of care dressing their hair? My double laughed in his eyes. They do, he said. And the rule? The rule is never fussy, said my double, still smiling. We don't want women to cease to be beautiful, and consciously beautiful if you like, he added. The more real beauty of form and face we have, the finer our world. But costly, sexualized trappings... I should have thought, I said, a class of women who traded on their sex would have risen. Women, I mean, who found an interest and an advantage in emphasizing their individual womanly beauty. There is no law to prevent it. Surely they would tend to counteract the severity of costume the rule dictates. There are such women. But for all that, the rule sets the key of everyday dress. If a woman is possessed by the passion for gorgeous raiment, she usually satisfies it in her own private circle, or with rare occasional onslaughts upon the public eye. Her everyday mood and the disposition of most people is against being conspicuous abroad. And I should say there are little liberties under the lesser rule, a discreet use of fine needlework and embroidery, a wider choice of materials. You have no changing fashions? None. For all that, are not our dresses as beautiful as ours? Our women's dresses are not beautiful at all, I said, forced for a time towards the mysterious philosophy of dress. Beauty? That isn't their concern. Then what are they after? My dear man, what is all my world after? End chapter 9, sections 4 and 5.
Chapter 9, Sections 6 to 8 of A Modern Utopia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. Chapter 9, Sections 6 to 8. I should come to our third talk with a great curiosity to hear of the last portion of the rule, of the things that the samurai are obliged to do. There would be many precise directions regarding his health and rules that would aim at once at health and that constant exercise of will that makes life good. Save in specified exceptional circumstances, the samurai must bathe in cold water, and the men must shave every day. They have the precisest directions in such matters. The body must be in health, the skin and muscles and nerves in perfect tone, or the samurai must go to the doctors of the order and give implicit obedience to the regimen prescribed. They must sleep alone at least 4 nights in 5. They must eat and talk to anyone in their fellowship who cares for their conversation for an hour, at least, at the nearest club house of the samurai, once on 3 chosen days in every week. Moreover, they must read aloud from the book of the samurai, for at least 10 minutes every day. Every month they must buy and read faithfully through at least one book that has been published during the past 5 years, and the only intervention with private choice in that matter is the prescription of a certain minimum of length for the monthly book or books. But the full rule in these minor compulsory matters is so voluminous and detailed, and it abounds with alternatives. Its aim is rather to keep before the samurai, by a number of sample duties as it were, the need of, and some of the chief methods towards health of body and mind, rather than to provide a comprehensive rule, and to ensure the maintenance of a community of feeling and interests among the samurai, through habit, intercourse, and a living contemporary literature. These minor obligations do not earmark more than an hour in the day. Yet they serve to break down isolations of sympathy, all sorts of physical and intellectual sluggishness, and the development of unsocial preoccupations. Of many sorts. Women samurai who are married, my double told me, must bear children, if they are to remain married as well as in the order, before the second period for terminating a childless marriage is exhausted. I failed to ask for the precise figures from my double at the time, but I think it is beyond doubt that it is from samurai mothers of the greater or lesser rule that a very large proportion of the future population of Utopia will be derived. There is one liberty accorded to women samurai which is refused to men, and that is to marry outside the rule, and women married to men not under the rule are also free to become samurai. Here, too, it will manifest there is a scope for novels and the drama of life. In practice, it seems that it is only men of great poetic distinction outside the rule, or great commercial leaders, who have wives under it. The tendency of such unions is either to bring the husband under the rule, or take the wife out of it. There can be no doubt that these marriage limitations tend to make the samurai something of a hereditary class. Their children, as a rule, become samurai, but it is not an exclusive caste. Subject to the most reasonable qualifications, anyone who sees fit can enter it at any time, and so, unlike all other privileged castes the world has seen, it increases relatively to the total population, and may indeed, at last, assimilate almost the whole population of the earth. So much my double told me readily, but now he came to the heart of all his explanations, to the will and motives at the centre that made men and women ready to undergo discipline, to renounce the richness and elaboration of the sensuous life, to master emotions and control impulses, to keep in the key of effort while they have abundance about them, to rouse and satisfy all desires, and his exposition was more difficult. He tried to make his religion clear to me. The leading principle of the utopian religion is the repudiation of the doctrine of original sin. The utopians hold that man, on the whole, is good. That is their cardinal belief. Man has pride and conscience, they hold, that you may refine by training as you refine his eye or ear. He has remorse and sorrow in his being, coming on the heels of all inconsequent enjoyments. How can one think of him as bad? He is religious. Religion is as nature to him as lust and anger, less intense, indeed, but coming with the wide-sweeping inevitableness as peace comes after all tumults and sounds. And in Utopia they understand this, or at least the samurai do, clearly. They accept religion as they accept thirst, as something inseparably in the mysterious rhythms of life. And just as thirst and pride and all desires may be perverted in an age of abundant opportunities, and men may be degraded and wasted by intemperance and drinking, by display or by ambition, may be turned to evil by the dull, the base, and the careless. Slovenly indulgence in religious inclinations, a failure to think hard and discriminate as fairly as possible in religious matters, is just as alien to the men under the rule as it would be to drink deeply because they were thirsty, eat when glutted, evade a bath because the day was chilly, or make love to any bright-eyed girl who chanced to look pretty in the dusk. Utopia, which is to have every type of character that one finds on earth, will have its temples and its priests, just as it will have its actresses and wine, but the samurai will be forbidden the religion of dramatically lit altars, organ music, and incense, as distinctly as they are forbidden to love the painted woman, or the consolations of brandy. And to all the things that are less than religion and that seek to comprehend it, to cosmogonies and philosophies, to creeds and formulae, to catechisms and easy explanations, the attitude of the samurai, the note of the book of the samurai, will be distrust. These things, the samurai will say, are part of the indulgences that should come before a man submits himself to the rule. They are like the early gratifications of young men, experiences to establish renunciation. The samurai will have emerged above these things. The theology of the utopian rulers will be saturated with that same philosophy of uniqueness, the repudiation of anything beyond similarities and practical parallelisms, that saturates all their institutions. They will have analyzed exhaustively those fallacies and assumptions that arise between the one and the many, that have troubled philosophy since philosophy began. Just as they will have escaped their delusive unification of every species under its specific definition that has dominated unearthly reasoning, so they will have escaped the delusive simplification of God that vitiates all terrestrial theology. They will hold God to be complex and of an endless variety of aspects, to be expressed by no universal formula, nor approved in any uniform manner. Just as the language of Utopia will be synthesis, even so will its God be. The aspect of God is different in measure of every man's individuality, and the intimate thing of religion must, therefore, exist in human solitude, between man and God alone. Religion, in its quintessence, is a relation between God and man. It is perversion to make it a relation between man, and a man may no more reach God through a priest than love his wife through a priest. But just as a man in love may refine the interpretation of his feelings, and borrow expression from the poems and music of poetic men, so an individual man may at his discretion read books of devotion, and hear music that is in harmony with his inchoate feelings. Many of the samurai, therefore, will set themselves private regimens that will help their secret religious life, will pray habitually, and read books of devotion, but with these things the rule of the order will have nothing to do. Clearly, the God of the samurai is a transcendental and mystical God. So far as the samurai have a purpose in common in maintaining the state, and the order and progress of the world, so far, by their discipline and denial, by their public work and effort, they worship God together. But the fount of motives lies in the individual life. It lies in silent and deliberate reflections, and at this, the most striking of all rules of the samurai aims. For 7 consecutive days in the year, at least, Each man or woman under the rule must go right out of all life of man into some wild and solitary place, must speak to no man or woman, and have no sort of intercourse with mankind. They must go bookless and weaponless, without pen or paper, or money. Provisions must be taken for the period of the journey, a rug or a sleeping sack, for they must sleep under the open sky, but no means of making a fire. They may study maps beforehand to guide them, showing any difficulties and dangers in the journey, but they may not carry such helps. They must not go by beaten ways or wherever there are inhabited houses, but into the bare, quiet places of the globe, the regions set apart for them. This discipline, my double said, was invented to secure a certain stoutness of heart and body in the members of the order, which otherwise might have lain open to too many timorous, merely abstemious men and women. Many things had been suggested, sword-play and tests that verge on torture, climbing in giddy places and the like, before this was chosen. Partly it is to ensure good training and sturdiness of body and mind, but partly also it is to draw their mind for space from the insistent details of life, from the intricate arguments and the fretting effort to work, from personal quarrels and personal affections, and the things of the heated room. Out they must go, clean out the world. Certain great areas are set apart for these yearly pilgrimages, beyond the securities of the state. There are thousands of square miles of sandy desert in Africa and Asia set apart, much of the Arctic and Antarctic circles, vast areas of mountain land and frozen marsh, secluded reserves of forest, and innumerable unfrequented lines upon the sea. Some are dangerous and laborious routes, some merely desolate, and there are even some sea journeys that one may take in the halcyon days as one drifts through a dream. Upon the seas one must go in a little undecked sailing boat, that may be rowed in a calm. All the other journeys one must do afoot, none aiding. There are about all these desert regions and along most coasts little offices at which the samurai says good-bye to the world of men, and at which they arrive after their minimum time of silence is overpast. For the intervening days they must be alone with nature, necessity, and their own thoughts. "It is good?" I said. "It is good," my double answered. "We civilized men go back to the stark mother that so many of us would have forgotten were it not for this rule. And one thinks, only 2 weeks ago I did my journey for the year. I went with my gear by the sea to Tromsø, and then inland to a starting place, and took my ice axe and rucksack, and said good-bye to the world. I crossed over 4 glaciers, I climbed 3 high mountain passes, and slept on moss in desolate valleys. I saw no human being for 7 days. Then I came down through the pine woods to the head of a road that runs to the Baltic shore. Altogether was 13 days before I reported myself again, and had speech with fellow creatures." "And the women do this?" "The women who are truly samurai, yes. Equally with the men, unless the killing of a child intervenes." I asked how it had seemed to him, and what he thought about during the journey. "There is always a sense of effort for me," he said. "When I leave the world at the outside of the journey, I turn back again and again, look at the little office as I go up my mountain side. The first day and night I'm a little disposed to shirk the job. Every year it's the same. A little disposed, for example, to sling my pack from my back, and sit down and go through its contents, and make sure I've got all my equipment." "There's no chance of anyone overtaking you?" "2 men mustn't start from the same office on the same route within 6 hours of each other. If they come within sight of each other, they must shun an encounter and make no sign, unless life is in danger. All that is arranged beforehand." "It would be, of course. Go on telling me of your journey." "I dread the night, I dread discomfort and bad weather. I only begin to brace up after the 2nd day." "Don't you worry about losing your way?" "No. There are cairns and skyline signs. If it wasn't for that, of course we should be worrying with maps the whole time. But I'm only sure of being a man after the 2nd night, and sure of my power to go through. And then one begins to get into it. The first 2 days one is apt to have the events of one's journey, little incidents of travel, and thoughts of one's work and affairs, rising and fading and coming again. But then the perspectives begin. I don't sleep much on the nights of these journeys. I lie awake and stare at the stars. About dawn, perhaps, and in the morning sunshine, I sleep. The nights this last time were very short, never more than twilight, and I saw the glow of the sun always, just over the edge of the world. But I had chosen the days of the new moon, so that I had to glimpse over the stars. Years ago I went from the Nile across the Libyan desert east, And then the stars in the later days of the journey, brought me near weeping. You begin to feel alone on the third day, when you find yourself out on the shining snowfield, and nothing of mankind visible on the whole world save one landmark, one remote thin triangle of iron, perhaps, in the saddle of the ridge against the sky. All this busy world that has done so much and so marvellously is still so little. You see it little as it is, and far off. All day long you go when the nights come, and it might be another planet. Then, in the quiet waking hours, one thinks of oneself, the great external things of space and eternity, and what means God. He mused. You think of death? Not of my own. But when I go among snow and desolations, and usually I take my pilgrimages in mountains of the north, I think very much of the night of this world, the time when our sun will be red and dull, and air and water will lie frozen together in the common snowfield where now the forests of the tropics are streaming. I think very much of that, and whether it is indeed God's purpose that our kind should end, and the cities we have built, the books we have written, all that we have given substance and a form, should lie dead beneath the snows. You don't believe in that? No. But if it is not so... I went threading my way among gorges and precipices, with my poor brain dreaming of what the alternative should be, with my imagination straining and failing. Yet, in those high airs, and in such solitude, a kind of exaltation comes to a man. I remember that one night I sat up and told the rascal stars very earnestly how they should not escape us in the end. He glanced at me for a moment as though he doubted I should understand. One becomes a personification of up there, he said. One becomes the ambassador of mankind to the outer world. There is time to think over a lot of things. One puts oneself and one's ambitions in a new pair of scales. Then there are hours when one is just exploring the wilderness like a child. Sometimes, perhaps, one gets a glimpse from some precipice edge of the plains far away, and houses and roadways, and remembers that there is still a busy world of men, and at last one turns one's feet down some slope, some gorge that leads back. You came down, perhaps, into a pine forest, and hear that queer clatter reindeer make, and then, it may be, you see a herdsman very far away, watching you. You wear your pilgrim's badge and make no sign of seeing you. You know, after these solitudes I feel just the same queer disinclination to go back to the world of men that I feel when I have to leave it. I think of dusty roads and hot valleys, and being looked at by many people. I think of the trouble of working with colleagues and opponents. This last journey I outstayed my time, camping in the pine woods of 6 days. Then my thoughts came round to my proper work again. I got keen to go on with it, and so I came back into the world. You come back physically clean, as though you had had your arteries and veins washed out, and your brain has been clean too. I shall stick to the mountains now until I am old, and then I shall sail a boat in Polynesia. That is what so many old men do. Only last year one of the great leaders of the samurai, a white-haired man who followed the rule in spite of his 111 years, was found dead in his boat far away from any land, far to the south, like a child asleep. That's better than to tumble to bed, said I, and some boy of a doctor jabbing you with infections, and distressful people hovering about you. Yes, said my double. In Utopia, we who are samurai die better than that. Is that how your great men die? It came to me suddenly as very strange that, even as we sat and talked across deserted seas, on burning sands, through the still aisles of forests, and in all the high and lonely places of the world, beyond the margin where the ways and houses go, solitary men and women sailed alone, or marched alone, or clambered. Quiet, resolute exiles, they stood alone amidst wildernesses of ice, on the precipitous banks of roaring torrents, in monstrous caverns, or steering a tossing boat in the little circle of the horizon amidst the tumbled incessant sea, all in their several ways communing with the emptiness, the enigmatic spaces and silences, the winds and torrents, and soulless forces that lie above the lit and ordered life of man. I saw more clearly now something I had seen dimly already, in the bearing and the faces of this utopian chivalry, a faint persistent tinge of detachment from the immediate heats and hurries, the little graces and delights, the tensions and simulations of the daily world. It pleased me strangely to think of this steadfast yearly pilgrimage of solitude, and how near men might come then to the high distances of God. After that I remember we fell talking of the discipline of the rule, of the courts that try breaches of it, and interpret doubtful cases. For, though a man may resign with due notice and be free after a certain time to rejoin again, one deliberate breach may exclude a man forever. Of the same of law that is grown up about such trials, and of the triennial council that revises and alters the rule. From that we pass to discussion of the general constitution of this world-state. Practically all political power vests in the samurai. Not only are they administrations, lawyers, practicing doctors, and public officials of almost all kinds, but they are the only voters. Yet, by a curious exception, the Supreme Legislative Assembly must have 1/10, and may have 1/2 of its members outside the order, because, it is alleged, that there is a sort of wisdom that comes of a sin and laxness, which is necessary to the perfect ruling of life. My double quoted me a verse from the canon on this matter, that my unfortunate verbal memory did not retain, but it is in the nature of a prayer to save the world from unfermented men. It would seem that Aristotle's idea of a rotation of rulers, an idea that crops up again in Harrington's Oceania, that first utopia of the sovereign people, a utopia that, through Danton's reading in English, played a disastrous part in the French Revolution, gets a little respect in Utopia. The tendency is to give practically permanent tenure to good men. Every ruler and official, it is true, is put on his trial every 3 years before a jury drawn by lot, according to the range of his activities, either from the samurai of his municipal area, or from the general catalogue of the samurai, but the business of this jury is merely to decide whether to continue him in office, or order a new election. In the majority of cases, the verdict is continuation. Even if it is not the officials may still appear as a candidate before the second and separate jury which fills the vacant post. My double mentioned a few scattered details of the electoral methods, but as at the time I believed we were having a number of further conversations, I did not exhaust my curiosities upon the subject. Indeed, I was more than a little preoccupied and inattentive. The religion of the samurai was after my heart, and it had taken hold of me very strongly. But presently I fell questioning him upon the complications that arise in the modern utopia, through the differences between the races of men, and found my attention returning. But the matter of that discussion I shall put apart into a separate chapter. In the end, we came back to the particulars of the great rule of life, that any man desiring of joining the samurai must follow. I remember how, after our third bout of talking, I walked back through the streets of utopian London to rejoin the botanist at our hotel. My double lived in an apartment in a great building. I should judge about where, in our London, the Tate Gallery squats, and as the day was fine, I had no reason for hurry. I went not by the covered mechanical way, but on foot, along the broad tree-set terraces that follow the river on either side. It was afternoon, and the mellow Thames Valley sunlight, warm and gentle, lit a clean and gracious world. There were many people abroad, going to and fro, unhurrying but not aimless, and I watched them so attentively that were you to ask me for the most elementary details of the buildings and terraces that back on either bank, or of the pinnacles and towers and parapets that lace the sky, I could not tell you them. But of the people I could tell you a great deal. No Utopians wear black, and for all the frequency of the samurai uniform along the England ways, the general effect is a gaily coloured population. You never see anyone noticeably ragged or dirty. The police, who answer questions and keep order, and are quite distinct from the organization of the pursuit of criminals, see to that, and shabby people are very infrequent. People who want to save money for other purposes, or who do not much bother with their clothing, seem to wear costumes of rough woven cloth, dyed an unobtrusive brown or green, over fine woolen underclothing, and so achieve a decent comfort in its simplest form. Others outside the rule of the samurai range the spectrum for colour, and have every variety of texture. The colours attained by the utopian dyers seem to me to be fuller and purer than the common range of stuffs on earth, and the subtle folding of the woolen materials witness that utopian Bradford is no whit behind her earthly sister. White is extraordinarily frequent. White woolen tunics and robes, into which are woven bands of brilliant colour, abound. Often these are the cut and purple edge that distinguishes the samurai. In utopian London, the air is as clear and less dusty than it is among the high mountains. The roads are made of unbroken surfaces and of friable earth. All heating is done by electricity, and no coal ever enters the town. There are no horses or dogs, and so there is not a suspicion of smoke, and scarcely a particle of any sort of dirt to render white impossible. The radiated influence of the uniform of the samurai has been keep costume simple, and this, perhaps, emphasizes the general effect of vigorous health of shapely bodies. Everyone is well grown and well nourished. Everyone seems in good condition. Everyone walks well, and has that clearness of eye that comes with cleanness of bud. In London, I am apt to consider myself of a passable size and carriage. Here I feel small and meaning look. The faint suspicions of spinal curvatures, skew feet, unequal legs, and ill-grown bones that haunt one in a London crowd, the plain intimations, in yellow faces, puffy faces, spotted and irregular complexions, in nervous movements and coughs and colds, of bad habits and an incompetent or disregarded medical profession, do not appear here. I notice few old people, but there seems to be a great proportion of men and women at or near the prime of life. I hang upon that. I have seen one or two fat people here. They are all the more noticeable because they are rare. But wrinkled age? Have I yet in Utopia set eyes on a bald head? The Utopians have brought a sounder psychological science than ours to bear upon regimen. People know better what to do and what to avoid, and how to foresee and forestall coming trouble, and how to evade and suppress the subtle poisons that blunt the edge of sensation. They have put off the years of decay. They keep their teeth, they keep their digestions, they ward off gout and rheumatism, neuralgia and influenza, and all those cognate decays that bend and wrinkle men in the middle years of existence. They have extended the level years far into the 70s, and age, when it comes swiftly and easily. The feverish hurry of our earth, and decay that begins before growth has ceased, is replaced by a ripe, prolonged maturity. This modern utopia is an adult world. The flushed romance, the predominant eroticisms, the adventurous uncertainty of a world in which youth prevails, gives place here to a grave deliberation, to a fuller and more powerful emotion, to a broader handling of life. Yet youth is here. Amidst the men whose faces have been made fine by thought and steadfast living, among the serene-eyed women, comes youth, gaily colored, buoyantly healthy, with challenging eyes, with fresh, eager faces. For everyone in Utopia who is sane enough to benefit, study, and training last until 20. Then comes the travel year, and many are still students until 24 or 25. Most are still, in a sense, students throughout life, but it is thought that, unless responsible action is begun in some form in the early 20s, will undergo a partial atrophy. But the full swing of adult life is hardly attained until 30 is reached. Men marry before the middle 30s, and the women rather earlier. Few are mothers before 20. The majority of those who become samurai do so between 27 and 35, and between 17 and 30, the Utopians have their dealings with love, and the play and excitement of love is a chief interest in life. Much freedom of act is allowed so that their wills may grow freely. For the past they end mad, and love gives place to some special and more enduring interest. Though, indeed, there is love between older men and fresh girls, and between youths and mature women. It is in these most graceful and beautiful years of life that such freedoms of dress as atmosphere of Utopia permits are to be seen, and the crude bright will and imagination of youth peeps out in ornament and colour. Figures come into my sight and possess me for a moment, and pass, and give place to others. There comes to a dusky little Jewess, red-lipped and amber-clad, with deep crimson flower, I know not whether real or sham, in the dull black of her hair. She passes me with an unconscious disdain, and then I am looking at a brightly smiling blue-eyed girl, tall, ruddy, and freckly warming, clad like a stage Rosalind, and talking gaily to a fair young man, a novice under the rule. A red-haired mother under the lesser rule goes by, green-gowned, with green straps crossing between her breasts, and her two shock-headed children, bare-legged and lightly shod, tug at her hands on either side. Then a grave man, in a long fur-trimmed robe, A merchant pygmy debates some serious matter with a white-tunicked clerk. In the clerk's face, I turn to mark the straight blue-black hair. The man must be Chinese. Then come two short-bearded men, in careless indigo-blue raiment, both of them convulsed with laughter, men outside the rule, who practise perhaps some art, and then one of the samurai in cheerful altercation with the blue-robed girl of 8. "But you could have come back yesterday, Dada," she persists. He is deeply sunburnt, and suddenly there passes before my mind the picture of a snowy mountain waste at nightfall, and a solitary small finger under the stars. When I come back to the present thing again, my eye is caught at once by a young negro, carrying books in his hand, a prosperous-looking, self-respecting young negro, in a trimly cut coat of purple, blue, and silver. I am reminded of what my double said to me of race. End of Chapter 9, Section 6 to 8. Recording by Vishnu Mambakam, Windsor.
Chapter 10 of A Modern Utopia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Felicity Campbell. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. Chapter the 10th, Race in Utopia, Section 1. Above the sphere of the elemental cravings and necessities, the soul of man is in a perpetual vacillation between two conflicting impulses: the desire to assert his individual differences, the desire for distinction, and his terror of isolation. He wants to stand out, but not too far out, and, on the contrary, he wants to merge himself with a group, with some larger body, but not altogether. Through all the things of life runs this tortuous compromise. Men follow the fashions, but resent ready-made uniforms on every plane of their being. The disposition to form aggregations and to imagine aggregations is part of the incurable nature of man. It is one of the great natural forces the statesman must utilize, and against which he must construct effectual defences. The study of the aggregations and of the ideals of aggregations about which men's sympathies will twine, and upon which they will base a large proportion of their conduct and personal policy, is the legitimate definition of sociology. Now, the sort of aggregation to which men and women will refer themselves is determined partly by the strength and idiosyncrasy of the individual imagination, and partly by the reek of ideas that chances to be in the air at the time. Men and women may vary greatly, both in their innate and their acquired disposition towards this sort of larger body or that, to which their social reference can be made. The natural social reference of a man is probably to some rather vaguely conceived tribe, as the natural social reference of a dog is to a pack. But just as the social reference of a dog may be educated until the reference to a pack is completely replaced by a reference to an owner, so on his higher plane of educability, the social reference of the civilized man undergoes the most remarkable transformations. But the power and scope of his imagination, and the need he has of response, sets limits to this process. A highly intellectualized, mature mind may refer for its data very consistently to ideas of a higher being so remote and indefinable as God, so comprehensive as humanity, so far-reaching as the purpose in things. I write may, but I doubt if this exaltation of reference is ever permanently sustained. Kant, in his Positive Polity, exposes his soul with great freedom, and the curious may trace how, while he professes and quite honestly intends to refer himself always to his greater being, humanity, he narrows constantly to his projected Western Republic of civilized men, and quite frequently to the minute, indefinite body of positivist subscribers. And the history of the Christian Church, with its development of orders and cults, sects and dissents, the history of fashionable society with its cliques and sets, and every political history with its cabals and inner cabinets, witness to the struggle that goes on in the minds of men to adjust themselves to a body larger indeed than themselves, but which still does not strain and escape their imaginative grasp. The statesman, both for himself and others, must recognize this inadequacy of grasp, and the necessity for real and imaginary aggregations to sustain men in their practical service of the order of the world. He must be a sociologist. He must study the whole science of aggregations in relation to that world state to which his reason and his maturest thought direct him. He must lend himself to the development of aggregatory ideas that favour the civilizing process, and he must do his best to promote the disintegration of aggregations and the effacement of aggregatory ideas that keep men narrow and unreasonably prejudiced one against another. He will, of course, know that few men are even rudely consistent in such matters, that the same man in different moods and on different occasions is capable of referring himself in perfect good faith not only to different but to contradictory larger beings, and that the more important thing about an aggregatory idea from the state-maker's point of view is not so much what it explicitly involves as what it implicitly repudiates. The natural man does not feel he is aggregating at all, unless he aggregates against something. He refers himself to the tribe, he is loyal to the tribe, and quite inseparably he fears or dislikes those outside the tribe. The tribe is always at least defensively hostile, and usually actively hostile to humanity beyond the aggregation. The anti-idea, it would seem, is inseparable from the aggregatory idea. It is a necessity of the human mind. When we think of the class A as desirable, we think of not A as undesirable. The two things are as inevitably connected as the tendons of our hands, so that when we flatten down our little fingers on our palms, the fourth digit, whether we want it or not, comes down halfway. All real working gods, one may remark, all gods that are worshipped emotionally, are tribal gods, and every attempt to universalize the idea of God trails dualism and the devil after it as a moral necessity. When we inquire, as well as the unformed condition of terrestrial sociology permits, into the aggregatory ideas that seem to satisfy men, we find a remarkable complex, a disorderly complex in the minds of nearly all our civilized contemporaries. For example, all sorts of aggregatory ideas come and go across the chameleon surfaces of my botanist's mind. He has a strong feeling for systematic botanists as against plant physiologists, whom he regards as lewd and evil scoundrels in this relation, but he has a strong feeling for all botanists, and indeed all biologists, as against physicists and those who profess the exact sciences, all of whom he regards as dull, mechanical, ugly-minded scoundrels in this relation. But he has a strong feeling for all who profess what is called science, as against psychologists, sociologists, philosophers, and literary men, whom he regards as wild, foolish, immoral scoundrels in this relation. But he has a strong feeling for all educated men, as against the working man, whom he regards as a cheating, lying, loafing, drunken, thievish, dirty scoundrel in this relation. But so soon as the working man is comprehended together with those others as Englishmen, which includes in this case, I may remark, the Scottish and Welsh, he holds them superior to all other sorts of European, whom he regards etc. Now one perceives in all these aggregatory ideas and rearrangements of the sympathies one of the chief vices of human thought, due to its obsession by classificatory suggestions. Footnote: see chapter the first, section 5, and the Appendix. The necessity for marking our classes has brought with it a bias for false and excessive contrast, and we never invent a term but we are at once cramming it with implications beyond its legitimate content. There is no feat of irrelevance that people will not perform quite easily in this way. There is no class, however accidental, to which they will not at once ascribe deeply distinctive qualities. The seventh sons of seventh sons have remarkable powers of insight. People with a certain sort of air commit crimes of violence. People with red hair have souls of fire. All democratic socialists are trustworthy persons. All people born in Ireland have vivid imaginations, and all Englishmen are clods. All Hindus are cowardly liars. All curly-haired people are good-natured. All hunchbacks are energetic and wicked, and all Frenchmen eat frogs. Such stupid generalizations have been believed with the utmost readiness, and acted upon by great numbers of sane, respectable people. And when the class is one's own class, when it expresses one of the aggregations to which one refers one's own activities, then the disposition to divide all qualities between this class and its converse, and to cram one's own class with every desirable distinction, becomes overwhelming. It is part of the training of the philosopher to regard all such generalizations with suspicion. It is part of the training of the utopist and statesman, and all good statesmen are utopists, to mingle something very like animosity with that suspicion, for crude classifications and false generalizations are the curse of all organized human life. Section 2. Disregarding classes, cliques, sets, castes, and the like minor aggregations concerned for the most part with details and minor aspects of life, one finds among the civilized peoples of the world certain broad types of aggregatory idea. There are, firstly, the national ideas, ideas which, in their perfection, require a uniformity of physical and mental type, a common idiom, a common religion, a distinctive style of costume, decoration, and thought, and a compact organization acting with complete external unity. Like the Gothic cathedral, the national idea is never found complete with all its parts, but one has in Russia, with her insistence on political and religious orthodoxy, something approaching it pretty closely, and again in the inland and typical provinces of China, where even a strange pattern of hat arouses hostility. We had it in vigorous struggle to exist in England, under the earlier Georges, in the minds of those who supported the established church. The idea of the fundamental nature of nationality is so ingrained in thought, with all the usual exaggeration of implication, that no one laughs at talk about Swedish painting or American literature, and I will confess and point out that my own detachment from these delusions is so imperfect and discontinuous that in another passage I have committed myself to a short assertion of the exceptionally noble quality of the English imagination. Footnote, chapter the 7th, section 6. I am constantly gratified by flattering untruths about English superiority, which I should reject indignantly were the application bluntly personal, and I am ever ready to believe the scenery of England, the poetry of England, even the decoration and music of England, in some mystic and impregnable way, the best. This habit of intensifying all class definitions, and particularly those in which one has a personal interest, is in the very constitution of man's mind. It is part of the defect of that instrument. We may watch against it and prevent it doing any great injustices or leading us into follies, but to eradicate it is an altogether different matter. There it is, to be reckoned with, like the coccyx, the pineal eye, and the vermiform appendix, and a too consistent attack on it may lead simply to its inversion, to a vindictively pro-foreigner attitude that is equally unwise. The second sort of aggregatory ideas, running very often across the boundaries of national ideas and in conflict with them, are religious ideas. In Western Europe, true national ideas only emerged to their present hectic vigour after the shock of the Reformation had liberated men from the great tradition of a Latin-speaking Christendom, a tradition the Roman Catholic Church has sustained as its modification of the old Latin-speaking imperialism in the rule of the Pontifex Maximus. There was, and there remains to this day, a profound disregard of local dialect and race in the Roman Catholic tradition, which has made that church a persistently disintegrating influence in national life. Equally spacious and equally regardless of tongues and peoples is the great Arabic-speaking religion of Mahomet. Both Christendom and Islam are indeed, on their secular sides, imperfect realizations of a utopian world state. But the secular side was the weaker side of these cults. They produced no sufficiently great statesmen to realize their spiritual forces. And it is not in Rome under pontifical rule, nor in Munster under the Anabaptists, but rather in Thomas à Kempis and St. Augustine's City of God, that we must seek for the utopias of Christianity. In the last 100 years, a novel development of material forces, and especially of means of communication, has done very much to break up the isolations in which nationality perfected its prejudices, and so to render possible the extension and consolidation of such a worldwide culture as medieval Christendom and Islam foreshadowed. The first onset of these expansive developments has been marked in the world of mind by an expansion of political ideals. Comte's Western Republic, 1848, was the first utopia that involved the synthesis of numerous states, by the development of imperialisms in the place of national policies, and by the search for a basis for wider political unions in racial traditions and linguistic affinities. Anglo-Saxonism, Pan-Germanism, and the like are such synthetic ideas. Until the 80s, the general tendency of progressive thought was at one with the older Christian tradition which ignored race, and the aim of the expansive liberalism movement, so far as it had a clear aim, was to Europeanize the world, to extend the franchise to Negroes, put Polynesians into trousers, and train the teeming myriads of India to appreciate the exquisite lilt of The Lady of the Lake. There is always some absurdity mixed with human greatness, and we must not let the fact that the Middle Victorians counted Scott, the suffrage, and pantaloons among the supreme blessings of life, conceal from us the very real nobility of their dream of England's mission to the world. We of this generation have seen a flood of reaction against such universalism. The great intellectual developments that centre upon the work of Darwin have exacerbated the realization that life is a conflict between superior and inferior types. It has underlined the idea that specific survival rates are of primary significance in the world's development, and a swarm of inferior intelligences has applied to human problems elaborated and exaggerated versions of these generalizations. These social and political followers of Darwin have fallen into an obvious confusion between race and nationality, and into the natural trap of patriotic conceit. The descent of the Indian and colonial governing class to the first crude applications of liberal propositions in India has found a voice of unparalleled penetration in Mr. Kipling, whose want of intellectual deliberation is only equalled by his poetic power. The search for a basis for a new political synthesis in adaptable sympathies based on linguistic affinities was greatly influenced by Max Muller's unaccountable assumption that language indicated kindred, and led straight to wildly speculative ethnology, to the discovery that there was a Celtic race, a Teutonic race, an Indo-European race, and so forth. A book that has had enormous influence in this matter because of its use in teaching is J.R. Green's Short History of the English People, with its grotesque insistence upon Anglo-Saxonism. And just now the world is in a sort of delirium about race and the racial struggle. The Briton forgetting his Defoe, footnote, the true-born Englishman, the Jew forgetting the very word proselyte, the German forgetting his anthropometric variations, and the Italian forgetting everything, are obsessed by the singular purity of their blood, and the danger of contamination the mere continuance of other races involves. True to the law that all human aggregation involves the development of a spirit of opposition to whatever is external to the aggregation, extraordinary intensifications of racial definition are going on. The vileness, the inhumanity, the incompatibility of alien races is being steadily exaggerated. The natural tendency of every human being towards a stupid conceit in himself and his kind, a stupid depreciation of all unlikeness, is traded upon by this bastard science. With the weakening of national references, and with the pause before reconstruction in religious belief, these new arbitrary and unsubstantial race prejudices become daily more formidable. They are shaping policies and modifying laws, and they will certainly be responsible for a large proportion of the wars, hardships, and cruelties the immediate future holds in store for our earth. No generalizations about race are too extravagant for the inflamed credulity of the present time. No attempt is ever made to distinguish differences in inherent quality, the true racial differences, from artificial differences due to culture. No lesson seems ever to be drawn from history of the fluctuating incidents of the civilizing process first upon this race and then upon that. The politically ascendant peoples of the present phase are understood to be the superior races, including such types as the Sussex farm labourer, the Bowery tough, the London hooligan, and the Paris Apache. The races not at present prospering politically, such as the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Spanish, the Moors, the Chinese, the Hindus, the Peruvians, and all uncivilized people, are represented as the inferior races, unfit to associate with the former on terms of equality, unfit to intermarry with them on any terms, unfit for any decisive voice in human affairs. In the popular imagination of Western Europe, the Chinese are becoming bright gamboge in colour and unspeakably abominable in every respect. The people who are black, the people who have fuzzy hair and flattish noses and no calves to speak of, are no longer held to be within the pale of humanity. These superstitions work out along the obvious lines of the popular logic. The depopulation of the Congo Free State by the Belgians, the horrible massacres of Chinese by European soldiery during the Pekin expedition, are condoned as a painful but necessary part of the civilizing process of the world. The worldwide repudiation of slavery in the 19th century was done against a vast sullen force of ignorant pride, which, reinvigorated by the new delusions, swings back again to power. Science is supposed to lend its sanction to race mania, but it is only science as it is understood by very illiterate people that does anything of the sort. Scientist science, in fact. What science has to tell about the races of man will be found compactly set forth by Dr. J. Deinker in the book published under that title. Footnote: see also an excellent paper in the American Journal of Sociology for March 1904, The Psychology of Race Prejudice by W. I. Thomas. From that book one may learn the beginnings of race charity. Save for a few isolated pools of savage humanity, there is probably no pure race in the whole world. The great continental populations are all complex mixtures of numerous and fluctuating types. Even the Jews present every kind of skull that is supposed to be racially distinctive, a vast range of complexion, from blackness in Goa to extreme fairness in Holland, and a vast mental and physical diversity. Were the Jews to discontinue all intermarriage with other races henceforth for ever, it would depend upon quite unknown laws of fecundity, prepotency, and variability what their final type would be, or indeed whether any particular type would ever prevail over diversity. And without going beyond the natives of the British Isles, one can discover an enormous range of types, tall and short, straight-haired and curly, fair and dark, supremely intelligent and unteachably stupid, straightforward, disingenuous, and what not. The natural tendency is to forget all this range directly race comes under discussion, to take either an average or some quite arbitrary ideal as the type, and think only of that. The more difficult thing to do, but the thing that must be done if we are to get just results in this discussion, is to do one's best to bear the range in mind. Let us admit that the average Chinaman is probably different in complexion, and indeed in all his physical and psychical proportions from the average Englishman. Does that render their association upon terms of equality in a world state impossible? What the average Chinaman or Englishman may be is of no importance whatever to our plan of a world state. It is not averages that exist, but individuals. The average Chinaman will never meet the average Englishman anywhere. Only individual Chinamen will meet individual Englishmen. Now among Chinamen will be found a range of variety as extensive as among Englishmen, and there is no single trait presented by all Chinamen and no Englishman, or vice versa. Even the oblique eye is not universal in China, and there are probably many Chinamen who might have been changed at birth, taken away and educated into quite passable Englishmen. Even after we have separated out and allowed for the differences in carriage, physique, moral prepossessions, and so forth, due to their entirely divergent cultures, there remains no doubt a very great difference between the average Chinaman and the average Englishman, but would that amount to a wider difference than is to be found between extreme types of Englishmen? For my own part, I do not think that it would, but it is evident that any precise answer can be made only when anthropology has adopted much more exact and exhaustive methods of inquiry, and a far more precise analysis than its present resources permit. Be it remembered how doubtful and tainted is the bulk of our evidence in these matters. These are extraordinarily subtle inquiries, from which few men succeed in disentangling the threads of their personal associations, the curiously interwoven strands of self-love and self-interest that affect their inquiries. One might almost say that instinct fights against such investigations, as it does undoubtedly against many necessary medical researches, but while a long special training, a high tradition, and the possibility of reward and distinction enable the medical student to face many tasks that are at once undignified and physically repulsive, the people from whom we get our anthropological information are rarely men of more than average intelligence and of no mental training at all. And the problems are far more elusive, It surely needs at least the gifts and training of a first-class novelist, combined with a sedulous patience that probably cannot be hoped for in combination with these, to gauge the all-round differences between man and man. Even where there are no barriers of language and colour, understanding may be nearly impossible. How few educated people seem to understand the servant class in England, or the working men! Except for Mr. Bart Kennedy's A Man Adrift, I know of scarcely any book that shows a really sympathetic and living understanding of the navvy, the longshore sailorman, the rough chap of our own race. Caricatures, luridly tragic or gaily comic, in which the misconceptions of the author blend with the preconceptions of the reader and achieve success, are of course common enough. And then consider the sort of people who pronounce judgments on the moral and intellectual capacity of the Negro, the Malay, or the Chinaman. You have missionaries, native schoolmasters, employers of coolies, traders, simple downright men, who scarcely suspect the existence of any sources of error in their verdicts, who are incapable of understanding the difference between what is innate and what is acquired, much less of distinguishing them in their interplay. Now and then one seems to have a glimpse of something really living, in Mary Kingsley's buoyant work, for instance, and even that may be no more than my illusion. For my own part, I am disposed to discount all adverse judgments and all statements of insurmountable differences between race and race. I talk upon racial qualities to all men who have had opportunities of close observation, and I find that their insistence upon these differences is usually in inverse proportion to their intelligence. It may be the chance of my encounters, but that is my clear impression. Common sailors will generalise in the profoundest way about Irishmen and Scotchmen, and Yankees and Nova Scotians and Dutchies, until one might think one talked of different species of animal. But the educated explorer flings clear of all these delusions. To him, men present themselves individualized, and if they classify, it is by some skin-deep accident of tint, some trick of the tongue or habit of gesture, or such like superficiality. And after all, there exists today available one kind at least of unbiased anthropological evidence. There are photographs. Let the reader turn over the pages of some such copiously illustrated work as The Living Races of Mankind, footnote, The Living Races of Mankind by H.N. Hutchinson, J.W. Gregory, and R. Lydekker, Hutchinson, and look into the eyes of one alien face after another. Are they not very like the people one knows? For the most part, one finds it hard to believe that, with a common language and common social traditions, one would not get on very well with these people. Here or there is a brutish or evil face, but you can find as brutish and evil in the Strand on any afternoon. There are differences, no doubt, but fundamental incompatibilities, no. And very many of them send out a ray of special resemblance and remind one more strongly of this friend or that than they do of their own kind. One notes with surprise that one's good friend and neighbour X and an anonymous naked Gold Coast Negro belong to one type, as distinguished from one's dear friend Y, and a beaming individual from Somaliland, who as certainly belong to another. In one matter, the careless and prejudiced nature of accepted racial generalizations is particularly marked. A great and increasing number of people are persuaded that half-breeds are peculiarly evil creatures, as hunchbacks and bastards were supposed to be in the Middle Ages. The full legend of the wickedness of the half-breed is best to be learned from a drunken mean white from Virginia or the Cape. The half-breed, one hears, combines all the vices of either parent. He is wretchedly poor in health and spirit, but vindictive, powerful, and dangerous to an extreme degree. His morals, the mean white has high and exacting standards, are indescribable even in whispers in a saloon, and so on and so on. There is really not an atom of evidence an unprejudiced mind would accept to sustain any belief of this sort. There is nothing to show that the children of racial admixture are, as a class, inherently either better or worse in any respect than either parent. There is an equally baseless theory that they are better, a theory displayed to a fine degree of foolishness in the article on Shakespeare in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. Both theories belong to the vast edifice of sham science that smothers the realities of modern knowledge. It may be that most half-breeds are failures in life, but that proves nothing. They are, in an enormous number of cases, illegitimate and outcast from the normal education of either race. They are brought up in homes that are the battlegrounds of conflicting cultures. They labour under a heavy premium of disadvantage. There is, of course, a passing suggestion of Darwin's to account for atavism that might go to support the theory of the vileness of half-breeds, if it had ever been proved, but then it never has been proved. There is no proof in the matter at all. End of chapter the 10th, sections 1 and 2. Recording by Felicity Campbell, book1forme.com, Whanganui, New Zealand. Chapter 10 of A Modern Utopia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Modern Utopia by H. G. Wells. Chapter the 10th, Section 3. Suppose now there is such a thing as an all-round inferior race. Is there any reason why we should propose to preserve it forever in a condition of tutelage? Whether there is a race so inferior I do not know, but certainly there is no race so superior as to be trusted with human charges. The true answer to Aristotle's plea for slavery, that there are natural slaves, lies in the fact that there are no natural masters. Power is no more to be committed to men without discipline and restriction than alcohol. The true objection to slavery is not that it is unjust to the inferior, but that it corrupts the superior. There is only one sane and logical thing to be done with a really inferior race, and that is to exterminate it. Now there are various ways of exterminating a race, and most of them are cruel. You may end it with fire and sword after the old Hebrew fashion. You may enslave it and work it to death, as the Spaniards did the Caribs. You may set it boundaries and then poison it slowly with deleterious commodities, as the Americans do with most of their Indians. You may incite it to wear clothing to which it is not accustomed, and to live under new and strange conditions that will expose it to infectious diseases to which you yourselves are immune, as the missionaries do the Polynesians. You may resort to honest, simple murder, as we English did with the Tasmanians, or you can maintain such conditions as conduce to race suicide, as the British administration does in Fiji. Suppose then for a moment that there is an all-round inferior race. A modern utopia is under the hard logic of life, and it would have to exterminate such a race as quickly as it could. On the whole, the Fijian device seems the least cruel. But utopia would do that without any clumsiness of race distinction, in exactly the same manner and by the same machinery as it exterminates all its own defective and inferior strains, that is to say, as we have already discussed in chapter the 5th, section 1, by its marriage laws, and by the laws of the minimum wage. That extinction need never be discriminatory. If any of the race did, after all, proved to be fit to survive, they would survive. They would be picked out with a sure and automatic justice from the over-ready condemnation of all their kind. Is there, however, an all-round inferior race in the world? Even the Australian blackfellow is perhaps not quite so entirely eligible for extinction as a good, wholesome, horse-racing, sheep-farming Australian white might think. These queer little races, the blackfellows, the pygmies, the bushmen, may have their little gifts, a greater keenness, a greater fineness of this sense or that, a quaintness of the imagination or what not, that may serve as their little unique addition to the totality of our utopian civilization. We are supposing that every individual alive on earth is alive in Utopia, and so all the surviving blackfellows are there. Every one of them in Utopia has had what none have had on earth, a fair education and fair treatment, justice and opportunity. Suppose that the common idea is right about the general inferiority of these people, then it would follow that in Utopia most of them are childless and working at or about the minimum wage, and some will have passed out of all possibility of offspring under the hand of the offended law. But still, cannot we imagine some few of these little people, whom you must suppose neither naked nor clothed in the European style, but robed in the Utopian fashion, may have found some delicate art to practice, some peculiar sort of carving, for example, that justifies God in creating them? Utopia has sound sanitary laws, sound social laws, sound economic laws. What harm are these people going to do? Some may be even prosperous and admired, may have married women of their own or some other race, and so may be transmitting that distinctive thin thread of excellence to take its due place in the great synthesis of the future. And indeed, coming along that terrace in Utopia, I see a little figure, a little bright-eyed, bearded man, inky black, frizzy-haired, and clad in a white tunic and black hose, and with a mantle of lemon yellow wrapped about his shoulders. He walks as most Utopians walk, as though he had reason to be proud of something, as though he had no reason to be afraid of anything in the world. He carries a portfolio in his hand. It is that, I suppose, as much as his hair, that recalls the courtier latin to my mind. Section 4. I had already discussed the question of race with the botanist at Lucerne.
"But you would not like,"
he cried in horror,
"your daughter to marry a Chinaman or a Negro?"
"Of course," said I, "when you say Chinaman, you think of a creature with a pigtail, long nails, and insanitary habits, and when you say Negro, you think of a filthy-headed black creature in an old hat. You do this because your imagination is too feeble to disentangle the inherent qualities of a thing from its habitual associations."
"Insult isn't argument,"
said the botanist. "Neither is unsound implication. You make a question of race into a question of unequal cultures. You would not like your daughter to marry the sort of Negro who steals hens, but then you would also not like your daughter to marry a pure English hunchback with a squint, or a drunken cab tout of Norman blood. As a matter of fact, very few well-bred English girls do commit that sort of indiscretion. But you don't think it necessary to generalize against men of your own race because there are drunken cab touts. And why should you generalize against Negroes? Because the proportion of undesirables is higher among Negroes? That does not justify a sweeping condemnation. You may have to condemn most, but why all? There may be, neither of us knows enough to deny, Negroes who are handsome, capable, courageous."
"Ugh!"
said the botanist. "How detestable you must find Othello!" It is my utopia, and for a moment I could almost find it in my heart to spite the botanist by creating a modern Desdemona and her lover, sooty black to the lips, there before our eyes. But I am not so sure of my case as that, and for the moment there shall come nothing more than a swart-faced, dusky Burmese woman in the dress of the greater rule, with her tall Englishman, as he might be on earth, at her side. That, however, is a digression from my conversation with the botanist.
And the Chinaman?
Said the botanist. I think we shall have all the buff and yellow peoples intermingling pretty freely.
Chinamen and white women, for example?
Yes, I said, you've got to swallow that. Anyhow, you shall swallow that. He finds the idea too revolting for comment. I try and make the thing seem easier for him. Do try, I said, to grasp a modern utopian's conditions. The Chinaman will speak the same language as his wife, whatever her race may be. He will wear costume of the common civilized fashion. He will have much the same education as his European rival, read the same literature, bow to the same traditions. And you must remember, a wife in Utopia is singularly not subject to her husband. The botanist proclaims his invincible conclusion.
Everyone will cut her.
This is Utopia, I said, and then sought once more to tranquilize his mind. No doubt among the vulgar, coarse-minded people outside the rule there may be something of the sort. Every earthly moral blockhead, a little educated perhaps, is to be found in Utopia. You will no doubt find the cut and the boycott, and all those nice little devices by which dull people get a keen edge on life, in their place here, and their place here is somewhere, I turned a thumb earthward, there. The botanist did not answer for a little while. Then he said, with some temper and great emphasis,
Well, I'm jolly glad anyhow that I'm not to be a permanent resident in this utopia. If our daughters are to be married to Hottentots by regulation, I'm jolly glad.
He turned his back on me. Now, did I say anything of the sort? I had to bring him, I suppose. There's no getting away from him in this life, but, as I have already observed, the happy ancients went to their utopias without this sort of company.
Section 5.
What gives the botanist so great an advantage in all his anti-utopian utterances is his unconsciousness of his own limitations. He thinks in little pieces that lie about loose, and nothing has any necessary link with anything else in his mind, so that I cannot retort upon him by asking him, if he objects to this synthesis of all nations, tongues, and peoples in a world state, what alternative ideal he proposes. People of this sort do not even feel the need of alternatives. Beyond the scope of a few personal projects, meeting her again and things like that, they do not feel that there is a future. They are unencumbered by any baggage of convictions whatever in relation to that. That at least is the only way in which I can explain our friends' high intellectual mobility. Attempts to correlate statesmanship, which they regard with interest as a dramatic interplay of personalities, with any secular movement of humanity, they class with the differential calculus and Darwinism as things far too difficult to be anything but finally and subtly wrong. So the argument must pass into a direct address to the reader. If you are not prepared to regard a worldwide synthesis of all cultures and polities and races into one world state as the desirable end upon which all civilizing efforts converge, what do you regard as the desirable end? Synthesis, one may remark in passing, does not necessarily mean fusion, nor does it mean uniformity. The alternatives fall roughly under three headings. The first is to assume there is a best race, to define as well as one can that best race, and to regard all other races as material for extermination. This has a fine modern biological air, survival of the fittest. If you are one of those queer German professors who write insanity about Weltpolitik, you assume the best race is the Teutonic. Cecil Rhodes affected that triumph of creative imagination, the Anglo-Saxon race. My friend Moses Cohen thinks there is much to be said for the Jew. On its premises, this is a perfectly sound and reasonable policy, and it opens out a brilliant prospect for the scientific inventor for what one might call Weltapparat in the future, for national harrowing and reaping machines and race-destroying fumigations. The Great Plain of China, Yellow Peril, lends itself particularly to some striking wholesale undertaking. It might, for example, be flooded for a few days and then disinfected with volcanic chlorine, whether, when all the inferior races have been stamped out, the superior race would not proceed at once, or after a brief millennial period of social harmony, to divide itself into subclasses and begin the business over again at a higher level, is an interesting residual question into which we need not now penetrate. That complete development of a scientific Weltpolitik is not, however, very widely advocated at present, no doubt from a want of confidence in the public imagination. We have, however, a very audible and influential school, the modern imperialist school, which distinguishes its own race. There is a German, a British, and an Anglo-Saxon section in the school, and a wider teaching which embraces the whole white race in one remarkable tolerance, as the superior race, as one indeed superior enough to own slaves collectively, if not individually. And the exponents of this doctrine look with a resolute, truculent, but slightly indistinct eye to a future in which all the rest of the world will be in subjection to these elect. The ideals of this type are set forth pretty clearly in Mr. Kidd's Control of the Tropics. The whole world is to be administered by the white powers. Mr. Kidd did not anticipate Japan, who will see to it that their subjects do not prevent the utilization of the immense natural resources which they have in charge. Those other races are to be regarded as children, recalcitrant children at times, and without any of the tender emotions of paternity. It is a little doubtful whether the races lacking in the elementary qualities of social efficiency are expected to acquire them under the chastening hands of those races which, through strength and energy of character, humanity, probity, and integrity, and a single-minded devotion to conceptions of duty, are developing the resources of the richest regions of the earth over their heads, or whether this is the ultimate ideal. Next comes the rather incoherent alternative that one associates in England with official liberalism. Liberalism in England is not quite the same thing as liberalism in the rest of the world. It is woven of two strands. There is Whiggism, the powerful tradition of 17th century Protestant and Republican England, with its great debt to Republican Rome, its strong, constructive and disciplinary bias, its broad and originally very living and intelligent outlook. And interwoven with this, there is the sentimental and logical liberalism that sprang from the stresses of the 18th century, that finds its early scarce differentiated expression in Harrington's Oceana, and after fresh drafts of the tradition of Brutus and Cato, and some elegant trifling with noble savages, budded in La Cité Moraliste, flowered in the emotional democratic naturalism of Rousseau, and bore abundant fruit in the French Revolution. These are two very distinct strands. Directly they were freed in America from the grip of conflict with British Toryism, they came apart as the Republican and Democratic parties respectively. Their continued union in Great Britain is a political accident. Because of this mixture, the whole career of English-speaking liberalism, though it has gone to one unbroken strain of eloquence, has never produced a clear statement of policy in relation to other peoples politically less fortunate. It has developed no definite ideas at all about the future of mankind. The Whig disposition, which once had some play in India, was certainly to attempt to Anglicize the native, to assimilate his culture, and then to assimilate his political status with that of his temporary ruler. But interwoven with this Anglicizing tendency, which was also, by the by, a Christianizing tendency, was a strong disposition derived from the Rousseau strand to leave other peoples alone, to facilitate even the separation and autonomy of detached portions of our own peoples, to disintegrate finally into perfect, because lawless, individuals. The official exposition of British illiberalism today still wriggles unstably because of these conflicting constituents, but on the whole, the Whig strand now seems the weaker. The contemporary Liberal politician offers cogent criticism upon the brutality and conceit of modern imperialisms, but that seems to be the limit of his service. Taking what they do not say, and do not propose as an indication of liberal intentions, it would seem that the ideal of the British Liberals and of the American Democrats is to favour the existence of just as many petty, loosely allied, or quite independent nationalities as possible, just as many languages as possible, to deprecate armies and all controls, and to trust to the innate goodness of disorder and the powers of an ardent sentimentality to keep the world clean and sweet. The Liberals will not face the plain consequence that such a state of affairs is hopelessly unstable, that it involves the maximum risk of war with the minimum of permanent benefit and public order. They will not reflect that the stars in their courses rule inexorably against it. It is a vague, impossible ideal, with a rude sort of unworldly moral beauty like the gospel of the Doukhobors. Besides that charm, it has this most seductive quality to an official British Liberal, that it does not exact intellectual activity, nor indeed activity of any sort whatever. It is, by virtue of that alone, a far less mischievous doctrine than the crude and violent imperialism of the popular press. Neither of these two schools of policy, neither the international laissez-faire of the Liberals, nor hustle to the top imperialism, promise any reality of permanent progress for the world of men. They are the resort, the moral reference of those who will not think frankly and exhaustively over the whole field of this question. Do that, insist upon solutions of more than accidental applicability, and you emerge with one or other of two contrasted solutions, as the consciousness of kind or the consciousness of individuality prevails in your mind. In the former case, you will adopt aggressive imperialism, but you will carry it out to its thorough degree of extermination. You will seek to develop the culture and power of your kind of men and women to the utmost in order to shoulder all other kinds from the earth. If, on the other hand, you appreciate the unique, you will aim at such a synthesis as this utopia displays, a synthesis far more credible and possible than any other Weltpolitik. In spite of all the pageant of modern war, synthesis is in the trend of the world. To aid and develop it could be made the open and secure policy of any great modern empire now. Modern war, modern international hostility is, I believe, possible only through the stupid illiteracy of the mass of men and the conceit and intellectual indolence of rulers and those who feed the public mind. Were the will of the mass of men lit and conscious, I am firmly convinced it would now burn steadily for synthesis and peace. It would be so easy to bring about a world peace within a few decades, was there but the will for it among men. The great empires that exist need but a little speech and frankness one with another. Within, the riddles of social order are already half solved in books and thought. There are the common people and the subject peoples to be educated and drilled, to be led to a common speech and a common literature, to be assimilated and made citizens. Without, there is the possibility of treaties. Why, for example, should Britain and France, or either and the United States, or Sweden and Norway, or Holland, or Denmark, or Italy, fight any more for ever? And if there is no reason, how foolish and dangerous it is still to sustain linguistic differences and custom houses, and all sorts of foolish and irritating distinctions between their various citizens. Why should not all these peoples agree to teach some common language, French, for example, in their common schools, or to teach each other's languages reciprocally? Why should they not aim at a common literature, and bring their various common laws, their marriage laws and so on, into uniformity? Why should they not work for a uniform minimum of labour conditions through all their communities? Why then should they not, except in the interests of a few rascal plutocrats, trade freely and exchange their citizenship freely throughout their common boundaries? No doubt there are difficulties to be found, but they are quite finite difficulties. What is there to prevent a parallel movement of all the civilized powers in the world towards a common ideal and assimilation? Stupidity. Nothing but stupidity. A stupid brute jealousy, aimless and unjustifiable. The coarser conceptions of aggregation are at hand, the hostile, jealous patriotisms, the blare of trumpets and the pride of fools. They serve the daily need, though they lead towards disaster. The real and the immediate has us in its grip, the accidental personal thing. The little effort of thought, the brief sustained effort of will, is too much for the contemporary mind. Such treaties, such sympathetic international movements are but dream stuff yet on earth, though Utopia has realized them long since and already passed them by. End of chapter the 10th. Recording by Felicity Campbell, book1forme.com, Whanganui, New Zealand.
Chapter the 11th of A Modern Utopia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christopher Taylor. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. Chapter the 11th. The Bubble Bursts. Section 1. As I walk back along the river terrace to the hotel where the botanist awaits me, and observe the utopians I encounter, I have no thought that my tenure of Utopia becomes every moment more precarious. There float in my mind vague anticipations of more talks with my double, and still more of a steady elaboration of detail, of interesting journeys of exploration. I forget that a utopia is a thing of the imagination that becomes more fragile with every added circumstance, that, like a soap bubble, it is most brilliantly and variously colored at the very instant of its dissolution. This utopia is nearly done. All the broad lines of its social organization are completed now, the discussion of all of its general difficulties and problems. Utopian individuals pass me by. Fine buildings tower on either hand. It does not occur to me that I may look too closely. To find the people assuming the concrete and individual is not, as I fondly imagine, the last triumph of realization, but the swimming moment of opacity before the film gives way. To come to individual emotional cases is to return to the earth. I find the botanist sitting at a table in the hotel courtyard. "Well?" I say, standing before him. "I've been in the gardens on the river terrace," he answers, hoping I might see her again. "Nothing better to do?" "Nothing in the world." "You'll have your double back from India tomorrow. Then you'll have conversation." "I don't want it," he replies compactly. I shrug my shoulders, and he adds, "At least with him." I let myself down into a seat beside him. For a time I sat restfully enjoying his companionable silence, and thinking fragmentarily of those samurai and their rules. I entertained something of the satisfaction of a man who has finished building a bridge. I feel that I have joined together things that I had never joined before. My utopia seems real to me, very real. I can believe in it, until the metal chair back gives to my shoulder blades, and utopian sparrows twitter and hop before my feet. I have a pleasant moment of unhesitating self-satisfaction. I feel a shameless exultation to be there. For a moment I forget the consideration the botanist demands, the mere pleasure of completeness, of holding and controlling all the threads possesses me. "You will persist in believing," I say with an aggressive expository note, "that if you meet this lady, she will be a person with the memories and sentiments of her double on earth. You think she will understand and pity, and perhaps love you. Nothing of the sort is the case. I repeat with confident rudeness. Nothing of the sort is the case. Things are different altogether here. You can hardly tell even now how different are—" I discover he is not listening to me. "What is the matter?" I ask abruptly. He makes no answer, but his expression startles me. "What is the matter?" And then I follow his eyes. A woman and a man are coming through the great archway, and instantly I guess what has happened. She it is arrests my attention first. Long ago I knew she was a sweetly beautiful woman. She is fair, with frank blue eyes, that look with a sort of tender receptivity to her companion's face. For a moment or so they remain, greyish figures in the cool shadow, against the sunlit greenery of the gardens beyond. "It is Mary," the botanist whispers with white lips, but he stares at the form of the man. His face whitens. It becomes so transfigured with emotion that for a moment it does not look weak. Then I see his thin hand is clenched. I realize how little I understand his emotions. A sudden fear of what he will do takes hold of me. He sits white and tense as the two come into the clearer light of the courtyard. The man I see is one of the samurai, a dark, strong-faced man, a man I have never seen before, and she is wearing the robe that shows her a follower of the lesser rule. Some glimmering of the botanist's feelings strikes through to my slow sympathies. Of course, a strange man. I put out a restraining hand towards his arm. I told you, I say, that very probably, most probably, she would have met some other. I tried to prepare you. Nonsense, he whispers without looking at me. It isn't that. It's that scoundrel. He has an impulse to rise. That scoundrel, he repeats. He isn't a scoundrel, I say. How do you know? Keep still. Why are you standing up? He and I stand up quickly, I as soon as he. But now the full meaning of the group has reached me. I grip his arm. Be sensible, I say, speaking very quickly, and with my back to the approaching couple. He's not a scoundrel here. This world is different from that. It's caught his pride somehow and made a man of him. Whatever troubled them there? He turns a face of white wrath on me, of accusation, and for the moment of unexpected force. This is your doing, he says. You have done this to mock me. He, of all men. For a moment speech fails him. Then, you have done this to mock me. I try to explain very quickly. My tone is almost propitiatory. I never thought of it until now. But how did I know he was the sort of man a disciplined world has a use for? He makes no answer, but he looks at me with eyes that are positively baleful, and in the instant I read his mute but mulish resolve that utopia must end. Don't let that old quarrel poison all this, I say almost entreatingly. It happened all differently here. Everything is different here. Your double will be back tomorrow. Wait for him. Perhaps then you will understand. He shakes his head and then bursts out with, What do I want with the double? Double? What do I care if things have been different here? This. He thrusts me weakly back with his long white hand. My God, he says almost forcibly. What nonsense all this is. All these dreams, all utopias. There she is. Oh, but I have dreamt of her. And now... A sob catches him. I am really frightened by this time. I still try to keep between him and these utopians, and to hide his gestures from them. It's different here, I persist. It's different here. The emotion you feel has no place in it. It's a scar from the earth, the sore scar of your past. And what are we all but scars? What is life but a scarring? It's you who don't understand. Of course we are covered with scars. We live to be scarred. We are scars. We are the scars of the past. These dreams, these childish dreams. He does not need to finish his sentence. He waves an unteachable, destructive arm. My utopia rocks about me. For a moment, the vision of that great courtyard hangs real. There the utopians live real about me, going to and fro, and the great archway blazes with sunlight from the green gardens by the riverside. The man who is one of the samurai, and his lady, whom the botanist loved on earth, pass out of sight behind the marble flower-set trident that spouts coolness in the middle of the place. For a moment I see two working men in green tunics sitting on a marble seat in the shadow of the colonnade, and a sweet little silver-haired old lady, clad all in violet and carrying a book, comes towards us and lifts a curious eye at the botanist's gestures, and then... Scars of the past. Scars of the past, these fanciful, useless dreams. Section 2. There is no jerk, no sound, no hint of material shock. We are in London, and clothed in the fashion of the town. The sullen roar of London fills our ears. I see that I am standing beside an iron seat of poor design in that grey and gawky waste of asphalt. Trafalgar Square. And the botanist, with perplexity in his face, stares from me to a poor shriveled, dirt-lined old woman. My God, what a neglected thing she is, who proffers a box of matches. He buys almost mechanically and turns back to me. I was saying, he says, the past rules us absolutely. These dreams. His sentence does not complete itself. He looks nervous and irritated. You have a trick at times, he says instead, of making your suggestions so vivid. He takes a plunge. If you don't mind, he says in a sort of quavering ultimatum, we won't discuss that aspect of the question. The lady, I mean. Further. He pauses, and there still hangs a faint perplexity between us. But, I begin. For a moment we stand there, and my dream of utopia runs off me like water from an oiled slab. Of course, we lunched at our club. We came back from Switzerland by no dream train, but by the ordinary Bala Express. We have been talking of that Lucerne woman he harps upon, and I have made some novel comment on his story. I have touched certain possibilities. You can't conceivably understand, he says. The fact remains, he goes on, taking up the thread of his argument again with an air of having defined our field. We are the scars of the past. That's a thing one can discuss, without personalities. No, I say rather stupidly, no. You are always talking as though you could kick the past to pieces, as though one could get right out from oneself and begin afresh. It is your weakness. If you don't mind me being frank, it makes you seem harsh and dogmatic. Life has gone easily for you. You have never been badly tried. You have been lucky. You do not understand the other way about. You are hard. I answer nothing. He pants for breath. I perceive that in our discussion of his case, I must have gone too far, and that he has rebelled. Clearly, I must have said something wounding about that ineffectual love story of his. You don't allow for my position, he says, and it occurs to me to say, I am obliged to look at the thing from my own point of view. One or other of us makes a move. What a lot of filthy, torn paper scattered about the world. We walk slowly side by side towards the dirt-littered basin of the fountain, and stand regarding two grimy tramps who sit and argue on a further seat. One holds a horrible old boot in his hand. and gesticulates with it, while his other hand caresses his rag-wrapped foot. What does Chamberlain say? His words drift to us. Why, he says, what's the good of investing your capital where these here Americans may dump it flat any time they like? Were there not 2 men in green sitting on a marble seat? Section 3. We walk on, our talk suspended, past a ruthlessly clumsy hoarding, towards where men and women and children are struggling about a string of omnibuses. A news vendor at the corner spreads a newspaper placard upon the wood pavement, pins the corners down with stones, and we glimpse something about massacre in Odessa, discovery of human remains at Chertsey, shocking lynching outrage in New York State, German intrigues get a setback, the birthday honors, full list. Dear old familiar world. An angry parent in conversation with the sympathetic friend jostles against us. I'll knock his bloomin' young head off if he cheeks me again. It's these ear-brusted board schools. An omnibus passes, bearing on a board beneath an incorrectly drawn Union Jack, an exhortation to the true patriot to buy Bumper's British boiled jam. I am stunned beyond the possibility of discussion for a space. In this very place it must have been that the high terrace ran with the gardens below it, along which I came from my double to our hotel. I am going back, but now through reality, along the path I passed so happily in my dream, and the people I saw then are the people I am looking at now, with a difference. The botanist walks beside me, white and nervously jerky in his movements, his ultimatum delivered. We start to cross the road. An open carriage drives by, and we see a jaded, red-haired woman, smeared with paint, dressed in furs, and petulantly discontented. Her face is familiar to me, her face with a difference. Why do I think of her as dressed in green? Of course, she it was I saw leading her children by the hand. Comes a crash to our left, and a running of people to see a cab horse down on the slippery, slanting pavement outside St. Martin's Church. We go on up the street. A heavy-eyed young Jewess, a draggled prostitute, no crimson flower for her hair, poor girl, regards us with a momentary speculation, and we get a whiff of foul language from 2 newsboys on the curb. We can't go on talking, the botanist begins, and ducks aside just in time to save his eye from the ferrule of a stupidly held umbrella. He is going to treat our little tiff about the lady as closed. He has the air of picking up our conversation again at some earlier point. He steps into the gutter, walks round outside a Negro hawker, just escapes the wheel of a hansom, and comes to my side again. We can't go on talking of your utopia, he says, in a noise and crowd like this. We are separated by a portly man going in the opposite direction, and join again. We can't go on talking of utopia, he repeats, in London. Up in the mountains, in holiday time, it was all right. We let ourselves go. I've been living in utopia, I answer, tacitly adopting his tacit proposal to drop the lady out of the question. At times, he says, with a queer laugh, you almost made me live there too. He reflects. It doesn't do, you know. No. And I don't know whether, after all, I want. We are separated again by a half a dozen lifted flagstones, a burning brazier, and 2 engineers concerned with some underground business or other in the busiest hour of the day's traffic. Why shouldn't it do? I ask. It spoils the world of every day to let your mind run on impossible perfections. I wish, I shout against the traffic, I could smash the world of every day. My note becomes quarrelsome. You may accept this as the world of reality. You may consent to be one scar in an ill-dressed compound wound, but so, not I. This is a dream too, this world. Your dream, and you bring me back to it, out of utopia. The crossing of Bow Street gives me pause again. The face of a girl who is passing westward, a student girl, rather carelessly dressed, her books in a carrying strap, comes across my field of vision. The westward sun of London glows upon her face. She has eyes that dream. Surely no sensuous nor personal dream. After all, dispersed, hidden, disorganized, undiscovered, unsuspected even by themselves, The samurai of Utopia are in this world. The motives that are developed and organized there stir dumbly here and stifle in 10,000 futile hearts. I overtake the botanist, who got ahead at the crossing by the advantage of a dust cart. You think this is real because you can't wake out of it, I say. It's all a dream, and there are people, I'm just one of the first of a multitude, between sleeping and waking, who will presently be rubbing it out of their eyes. A pinched and dirty little girl, with sores upon her face, stretches out a bunch of wilting violets in a pitifully thin little fist, and interrupts my speech. Bunch of violets, only a penny. No, I say curtly, hardening my heart. A ragged and filthy nursing mother, with her last addition to our imperial people on her arm, comes out of a drink shop, and stands a little unsteadily, and wipes mouth and nose comprehensively with the back of a red chapped hand. Section 4. Isn't that reality? Says the botanist, almost triumphantly, and leaves me aghast at his triumph. That, I say belatedly, it's a thing in a nightmare. He shakes his head and smiles, exasperatingly. I perceive quite abruptly that the botanist and I have reached the limits of our intercourse. The world dreams things like that, I say, because it suffers from an indigestion of such people as you. His low-toned self-complacency, like the faded banner of an obstinate fort, still flies unconquered. And you know, he's not even a happy man with it all. For 10 seconds or more I am furiously seeking in my mind for a word, for a term of abuse, for one compendious verbal missile that shall smash this man forever. It has to express total inadequacy of imagination and will, spiritual anemia, dull respectability, gross sentimentality, a cultivated pettiness of heart. That word will not come, but no other word will do. Indeed, the word does not exist. There is nothing with sufficient vituperative concentration for this moral and intellectual stupidity of educated people. He begins. No, I can't endure him. With a passionate rapidity of movement, I leave his side, dart between a carriage and a van, duck under the head of a cab horse, and board a bus going westward somewhere. But anyhow, going in exactly the reverse direction to the botanist. I clamber up the steps and thread my swaying way to the seat immediately behind the driver. There, I say as I whack myself down on the seat and pant. When I look round, the botanist is out of sight. Section 5. But I am back in the world for all that, and my utopia is done. It is good discipline for the utopist to visit this world occasionally. But from the front seat of the top of an omnibus on a sunny September afternoon, the Strand, and Charing Cross Corner, and Whitehall, and the great multitude of people, the great uproar of vehicles, streaming in all directions, is apt to look a world altogether too formidable. It has a glare, it has a tumult and vigor that shouts one down. It shouts one down if shouting is to carry it. What good was it to trot along the pavement through this noise and tumult of life, pleading utopia to that botanist? What good would it be to recommend utopia in this driver's preoccupied ear? There are moments in the life of every philosopher and dreamer when he feels himself the flimsiest of absurdities, when the thing in being has its way with him, its triumphant way, when he asks in a roar, unanswerably, with a fine solid use of the current vernacular, what good is all this rot about utopias? One inspects the thing in being with something of the diffident speculation of primitive man, peering from behind a tree at an angry elephant. There is an omen in that image. On how many occasions must that ancestor of ours have had just the utopist feeling of ambitious unreality, have decided that on the whole it was wiser to go very quietly home again and leave the big beast alone. But, in the end, men rode upon the elephant's head. The thing in being that roars so tremendously about Charing Cross Corner seems a bigger antagonist than an elephant. But then we have better weapons than chipped flint blades. After all, in a very little time everything that impresses me so mightily this September afternoon will have changed or passed away forever. Everything. These omnibuses, These great, stalwart, crowded, many-colored things that jostle one another and make so handsome a clatter-clamor will all have gone, they and their horses and drivers and organization. You will come here and you will not find them. Something else will be here, some different sort of vehicle that is now perhaps the mere germ of an idea in some engineer student's brain. And this road and pavement will have changed, and these impressive great buildings, other buildings will be here. Buildings that are as yet more impalpable than this page you read, more formless and flimsy by far than anything that is reasoned here. Little plans sketched on paper, strokes of a pen or of a brush, will be the first materializations of what will at last obliterate every detail and atom of these re-echoing actualities that overwhelm us now. And the clothing and gestures of these innumerable people, the characters of their faces and bearing, these too will be recast in the spirit of what are now obscure and impalpable beginnings. The new things will be indeed of the substance of the thing that is, but differing just in the measure of the will and imagination that goes to make them. They will be strong and fair as the will is sturdy and organized, and the imagination comprehensive and bold. They will be ugly and smeared with wretchedness, as the will is fluctuating and the imagination timid and mean. Indeed, will is stronger than fact. It can mold and overcome fact. But this world has still to discover its will. It is a world that slumbers inertly. And all this roar and pulsation of life is no more than its heavy breathing. My mind runs on to the thought of an awakening. As my omnibus goes lumbering up Cockspur Street through the clatter-rattle of the cabs and carriages, there comes another fancy in my mind. Could one but realize an apocalyptic image, and suppose an angel, such as was given to each of the 7 churches of Asia, given for a space to the service of the greater rule? I see him as a towering figure of flame and color, standing between earth and sky, with a trumpet in his hands, over there above the Haymarket, against the October glow. And when he sounds, all the samurai, all who are samurai in Utopia, will know themselves and one another. Whoop, says a motor brougham, and a policeman stays the traffic with his hand. All of us who partake of the samurai would know ourselves and one another. For a moment I have a vision of this resurrection of the living, of a vague, magnificent answer, of countless myriads at attention, of all that is fine in humanity at attention, round the compass of the earth. Then that philosophy of individual uniqueness resumes its sway over my thoughts, and my dream of a world's awakening fades. I had forgotten. Things do not happen like that. God is not simple. God is not theatrical. The summons comes to each man in its due time for him, with an infinite subtlety of variety. If that is so, what of my utopia? This infinite world must needs be flattened to get it on one retina. The picture of a solid thing, although it is flattened and simplified, is not necessarily a lie. Surely in the end, by degrees and steps, something of this sort, some such understanding as this utopia must come. First here, then there, single men, and then groups of men will fall into line. Not indeed with my poor faulty hesitating suggestions, but with a great and comprehensive plan wrought out by many minds and in many tongues. It is just because my plan is faulty, because it misstates so much and omits so much, that they do not now fall in. It will not be like my dream, the world that is coming. My dream is just my own poor dream, the thing sufficient for me. We fail in comprehension. We fail so variously and abundantly. We see as much as it is serviceable for us to see, and we see no further. But the fresh, undaunted generations come to take on our work beyond our utmost effort, beyond the range of our ideas. They will learn with certainty things that to us are guesses and riddles. There will be many utopias. Each generation will have its new version of utopia, a little more certain and complete and real, with its problems lying closer and closer to the problems of the thing and being, until at last from dreams, utopias will have come to be working drawings, and the whole world will be shaping the final world state, the fair and great and fruitful world state that will only not be a utopia because it will be this world. So surely it must be. The policeman drops his hand. "Come up," says the bus driver, and the horses strain. Clitter, clatter, cluck, clack. The line of hurrying hansoms overtakes the omnibus going west. A dexterous lad on a bicycle with a bale of newspapers on his back dodges nimbly across the head of the column and vanishes up a side street. The omnibus sways forward, rapt and prophetic, his plump hands clasped around the handle of his umbrella, his billycock hat a trifle askew. This irascible little man of the voice, this impatient dreamer, this scolding optimist, who has argued so rudely and dogmatically about economics and philosophy and decoration, and indeed about everything under the sun, who has been so hard on the botanist and fashionable women, and so reluctant in the matter of beer, is carried onward, dreaming dreams, dreams that with all the inevitable ironies of difference may be realities when you and I are dreams. He passes, and for a little space we are left with his egoisms and idiosyncrasies more or less in suspense. But why was he intruded, you ask? Why could not A Modern Utopia be discussed without this impersonation, impersonally? It has confused the book, you say, made the argument hard to follow, and thrown a quality of insincerity over the whole. Are we but mocking at utopias, you demand? Using all these noble and generalized hopes as the backcloth against which two bickering personalities jar and squabble? Do I mean we are never to view the promised land again except through a foreground of fellow travelers? There is a common notion that the reading of a utopia should end with a swelling heart and clear resolves, with lists of names, formation of committees, and even the commencement of subscriptions. But this utopia began upon a philosophy of fragmentation, and ends, confusedly, amidst a gross tumult of immediate realities, in dust and doubt, with, at the best, one individual's aspiration. Utopias were once in good faith, projects for a fresh creation of the world, and of a most unworldly completeness. This so-called modern utopia is a mere story of personal adventures among utopian philosophies. Indeed, that came about without the writer's intention. So it was the summoned vision came. For I see about me a great multitude of little souls and groups of souls as darkened, as derivative as my own. With the passage of years, I understand more and more clearly the quality of the motives that urge me and urge them to do whatever we do. Yet that is not all I see, and I am not altogether bounded by my littleness. Ever and again, contrasting with this immediate vision, come glimpses of a comprehensive scheme, in which these personalities float, the scheme of a synthetic wider being, the great state, mankind in which we all move and go, like blood corpuscles, like nerve cells, it may be at times like brain cells in the body of a man. But the two visions are not seen consistently together, at least by me, and I do not know, surely, that they exist consistently together. The motives needed for those wider issues come not into the interplay of my vanities and wishes. That greater scheme lies about the men and women I know, as I have tried to make the vistas and spaces, the mountains, cities, laws, and order of utopia lie about my talking couple, too great for their sustained comprehension. When one focuses upon these two, that wide landscape becomes indistinct and distant, and when one regards that, then the real persons one knows grow vague and unreal. Nevertheless, I cannot separate these two aspects of human life, each commenting on the other. In that incongruity between great and individual, inheres the incompatibility I could not resolve, and which, therefore, I have had to present in this conflicting form. At times, that great scheme does seem to me to enter certain men's lives as a passion, as a real and living motive. There are those who know it almost as if it were a thing of desire. Even for me, upon occasion, little lures of the immediate life are seen small and vain, and the soul goes out to that mighty being, to apprehend it and serve it and possess. But this is an illumination that passes as it comes, a rare transitory lucidity, leaving the soul's desires suddenly turn to presumption and hypocrisy upon the lips. One grasps at the universe and attains bathos. The hungers, the jealousies, the prejudices and habits have us again, and we are forced back to think it is so, and not otherwise, that we are meant to serve the mysteries, that in these blinkers it is we are driven to an end we cannot understand. And then, for measured moments in the night watches, or as one walks alone, or while one sits in thought and speech with a friend, the wider aspirations glow again with a sincere emotion, with the colors of attainable desire. That is my all about Utopia, and about the desire and need for Utopia, and how that planet lies to this planet that bears the daily lives of men. End of chapter the 11th. Recording by Christopher Taylor.
Chapter 20 of A Modern Utopia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by CalmDragon. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. Chapter 20. Appendix. Scepticism of the Instrument. A portion of a paper read to the Oxford Philosophical Society, November 8, 1903, and reprinted with some revision from the version given in mind. Volume 13, NS, number 51. It seems to me that I may most propitiously attempt to interest you this evening by describing very briefly the particular metaphysical and philosophical system in which I do my thinking, and more particularly by setting out for the consideration one or two points, in which I seem to myself to differ most widely from current accepted philosophy. You must be prepared for things that will strike you as crude, for a certain difference of accent and dialect that you may not like. And you must be prepared to hear what may strike you as the clumsy statement of my ignorant rediscovery of things already beautifully thought out and said. But in the end, you may incline to forgive me some of this first offense. It is quite unavoidable that, in setting out these intellectual foundations of mine, I should lapse for a moment or so towards autobiography. A convergence of circumstances led to my having my knowledge of concrete things quite extensively developed before I came to philosophical examination at all. I have heard someone say that a savage or an animal is mentally a purely objective being, and in that respect I was like a savage or an animal until I was well over 20. I was extremely unaware of the subjective or introverted element in my being. I was a positivist without knowing it. My early education was a feeble one. It was one in which my private observation, inquiry, and experiment were far more important factors than any instruction. Or rather, perhaps the instruction I received was less even than what I learnt for myself. And it terminated at 13. I had come into pretty intimate contact with the harder realities of life, with hunger in various forms, and many base and disagreeable necessities before I was 15. About that age, following the indication of certain theological and speculative curiosities, I began to learn something of what I will call deliberately and justly elementary science. Stuff I got out of Cassell's Popular Educator and cheap textbooks, and then, through accidents, and ambitions that do not matter in the least to us now, I came to 3 years of illuminating and good scientific work. The central fact of those 3 years was Huxley's course in comparative anatomy at the school in Exhibition Road. About that as a nucleus I arranged a spacious digest of facts. At the end of that time I had acquired what I still think to be a fairly clear and complete and ordered view of the substantially real universe. Let me try to give you the chief things I had. I had man definitely placed in the great scheme of space and time. I knew him incurably for what he was, finite and not final, a being of compromises and adaptations. I had traced his lungs, for example, from a swimming bladder step by step, with scalpel and probe, through a dozen types or more. I had seen the ancestral cecum shrink to that disease nest, the appendix of today. I had watched the gill slit patch slowly to the purpose of the ear, and the reptile jaw suspension utilized to eke out the needs of a sense organ taken from its native and natural water. I had worked out the development of those extraordinarily unsatisfactory and untrustworthy instruments, man's teeth, from the skin scutes of the shark to their present function as a basis for gold stoppings, and followed the slow unfolding of the complex and painful process of gestation through which man comes into the world. I had followed all these things, and many kindred things, by dissection and in embryology. I had checked the whole theory of development again in a year's course of paleontology, and I had taken the dimensions of the whole process by the scale of the stars in a course of astronomical physics. And all that amount of objective elucidation came before I had reached the beginnings of any philosophical or metaphysical inquiry, any inquiry as to why I believed, how I believed, what I believed, or what the fundamental stuff of things was. Now, following hard upon this interlude with knowledge came a time when I had to give myself to teaching, and it became advisable to acquire one of those teaching diplomas that are so widely and so foolishly despised, and that enterprise set me to a superficial but suggestive study of educational method, of educational theory, of logic, of psychology, and so at last, when the little affair with the diploma was settled, to philosophy. Now, to come to logic over the bracing uplands of comparative anatomy is to come to logic with a lot of very natural preconceptions blown clean out of one's mind. It is, I submit, a way of taking logic in the flank. When you have realized to the narrow that all the physical organs of man, and all his physical structures, are what they are through a series of adaptations and approximations, and that they are kept up to a level of practical efficiency only by the elimination of death, and that this is true also of his brain, and of his instincts, and of his mental predispositions, you are not going to take his thinking apparatus unquestioningly as being in any way mysteriously different and better. And I had read only a little logic before I became aware of implications that I could not agree with, and assumptions that seemed to me to be altogether at a variance with the general scheme of objective fact established in my mind. I came to an examination of logical processes and of language with expectation that would share the profoundly provisional character, the character of irregular limitation and adaptation that pervades the whole physical and animal being of man, and I found the thing I had expected. And as a consequence I found a sort of intellectual hardihood about the assumptions of logic, and at first confused me, and then roused all the latent skepticism in my mind. My first quarrel with the accepted logic I had developed long ago in a little paper that was printed in the Fortnightly Review in July 1891. It was called The Rediscovery of the Unique, and rereading it I perceived not only how bad and even annoying it was in manner, a thing I have long known, but also how remarkably bad it was in expression. I have good reason for doubting whether my powers of expression in these uses have very perceptibly improved, but at any rate I am doing my best now with the previous failure before me. That unfortunate paper, among other oversights I can no longer regard as trivial, disregarded quite completely the fact that a whole literature upon the antagonism of the one and the many, of the specific ideal and the individual reality was already in existence. It defined no relations to other thought or thinkers. I understand now, what I did not understand then, why it was totally ignored, but the idea underlying that paper I cling to today. I consider it an idea that will ultimately be regarded as one of primary importance to human thought, and I will try and present the substance of that early paper again, now, very briefly, as the best opening of my general case. My opening skepticism is essentially a doubt of the objective reality of classification. I have no hesitation in saying that it is the first and primary position of my philosophy. I have it in my mind that classification is a necessary condition of the working of the mental implement. but that it is a departure from the objective truth of things. That classification is very serviceable for practical purposes of life, but a very doubtful preliminary to those fine penetrations the philosophical purpose, in its more arrogant moods, demands. All the peculiarities of my way of thinking derive from that. A mind nourished upon anatomical study is of course permeated with the suggestion of the vagueness and instability of biological species. A biological species is quite obviously a great number of unique individuals which is separable from other biological species only by the fact that an enormous number of the other linking individuals are inaccessible in time, are in other words dead and gone, and each new individual in that species does, in the distinction of its own individuality, break away in however infinitesimal degree from the previous average properties of the species. There is no property of any species, even the properties that constitute the specific definition, that is not a matter of more or less. If, for example, a species be distinguished by a single large red spot on the back, you will find, if you go over a great number of specimens, that the red spot shrinking here to nothing, expanding there to a more general redness, weakening to pink, deepening to russet and brown, shading into crimson, and so on, and so on. And this is true not only of biological species, it is true of the mineral specimens constituting a mineral species, and I remember as a constant refrain in the lectures of Professor Judd upon rock classification, the words, "They pass into one another by insensible gradations." That is true, I hold, of all things. You will think perhaps of atoms of the elements as instances of identically similar things. But these are things not of experience, but of theory, and there is not a phenomenon in chemistry that is not equally well explained on the supposition that it is merely the immense quantities of atoms necessarily taken in any experiment that mask by the operation of the law of averages the fact that each atom also has its unique quality, its special individual difference. This idea of uniqueness in all individuals is not only true of the classification of material science, it is true, and still more evidently true, of the species of common thought. It is true of common terms. Take the word chair. When one says chair, one thinks vaguely of an average chair, but collect individual instances, think of armchairs, and reading chairs, and dining room chairs, and kitchen chairs, chairs that pass into benches, chairs that cross the boundary and become settees and dentist chairs, thrones, opera stalls, seats of all sorts. Those miraculous fungoid growths that cumber the floor of the Arts and Crafts exhibition, and you will perceive what a lax bundle in fact is this simple, straightforward term. In cooperation with an intelligent joiner, I would undertake to defeat any definition of chair or chairishness that you gave me. Chairs, just as much as individual orgasms, just as much as mineral and rock specimens, are unique things. If you know them well enough, you will find an individual difference even in the set of machine-made chairs, and it is only because we do not possess minds of unlimited capacity, because our brain has only a limited number of pigeonholes for our correspondence with an unlimited universe of objective uniques, that we have to delude ourselves into the belief that there is a chairishness in the species common to and distinctive of all chairs. Let me repeat, this is of the very smallest importance in all the practical affairs of life, or indeed in relation to anything but philosophy and wide generalizations. But in philosophy, it matters profoundly. If I order 2 new-laid eggs for breakfast, up come 2 unhatched but still unique avian individuals, and the chances are they serve my rude physiological purpose. I can afford to ignore the hen's eggs of the past that were not quite so nearly this sort of thing, and the hen's eggs of the future that will accumulate modification age by age. I can venture to ignore the rare chance of an abnormality in chemical composition and of any startling aberration in my physiological reaction. I can, with a confidence that is practically perfect, say with unqualified simplicity, 2 eggs, but not if my concern is not my morning breakfast, but the utmost possible truth. Now let me go on to point out whither this idea of uniqueness tends. I submit to you that syllogism is based on classification, and that all hard logical reasoning tends to imply, and is apt to imply, a confidence in the objective reality of classification. Consequently, in denying that I deny the absolute validity of logic, classification and number, which in truth ignore the fine differences of objective realities, have in the past of human thought been imposed upon things. Let me, for clearness' sake, take a liberty here, commit, as you may perhaps think, an unpardonable insolence. Hindu thought and Greek thought alike impress me as being overmuch obsessed by an objective treatment of certain necessary preliminary conditions of human thought, number and definition and class and abstract form. But these things, number, definition, class, and abstract form, I hold, are merely unavoidable conditions of mental activity, regrettable conditions rather than essential facts. The forceps of our minds are clumsy forceps, and crush the truth a little in taking hold of it. It is about this difficulty that the mind of Plato played a little inconclusively all his life. For the most part he tended to regard the idea as the something behind reality, whereas it seems to me that the idea is the more proximate and less perfect thing, the thing by which the mind, by ignoring individual differences, attempts to comprehend an otherwise unmanageable number of unique realities. Let me give you a rough figure of what I am trying to convey in this first attack upon the philosophical validity of general terms. You have seen the results of those various methods of black and white reproduction that involve the use of a rectangular net. You know the sort of process picture I mean. It is used to employed very frequently in reproducing photographs. At a little distance you really seem to have a faithful reproduction of the original picture, but when you peer closely you find not the unique form and masses of the original, but a multiple of little rectangles, uniform in shape and size. The more earnestly you go into the thing, the closer you look, the more the picture is lost in reticulations. I submit the world of reasoned inquiry has a very similar relation to the world I call objectively real. For the rough purposes of every day, the network picture will do, but the finer your purpose, the less it will serve, and for an ideally fine purpose, for absolute and general knowledge that will be as true for a man at a distance with a telescope as for a man with a microscope, it will not serve at all. It is true you can make your net of logical interpretation finer and finer. You can fine your classification more and more, up to a certain limit. But essentially you are working in limits, and as you come closer, as you look at finer and subtler things, as you leave the practical purpose for which the method exists, the element of error increases. Every species is vague, every term goes cloudy at the edges, and so in my way of thinking, relentless logic is only another phrase for a stupidity, for a sort of intellectual pig-headedness. If you push a philosophical or metaphysical inquiry through a series of valid syllogisms, never committing any generally recognized fallacy, you nevertheless leave a certain rubbing and marginal loss of objective truth, and you get deflections that are difficult to trace, at each phase in the process. Every species waggles about it in its definition. Every tool is a little loose in its handle. Every scale has its individual error. So long as you are reasoning for practical purposes about the finite things of experience, you can every now and then check your process and correct your adjustments. But not when you make what are called philosophical and theological inquiries, when you turn your implement towards the final absolute truth of things. Doing that is like firing at an inaccessible, unmarkable, and indestructible target at an unknown distance with a defective rifle and variable cartridges. Even if by chance you hit, you cannot know that you hit, and so it will matter nothing at all. This assertion of the necessary untrustworthiness of all reasoning processes arising out of the fallacy of classification in what is quite conceivably a universe of uniques, forms only one introductory aspect of my general skepticism of the instrument of thought. I have now to tell you of another aspect of this skepticism of the instrument which concerns negative terms. Classes in logic are not only represented by circles with a hard, firm outline, whereas they have no such definite limits, but also there is a constant disposition to think of negative terms as if they represented positive classes. With words, just as with numbers and abstract forms, there are definite phases of human development. There is, you know, with regard to number, the phase which man can barely count at all, or counts in perfect good faith and sanity upon his fingers. Then there is the phase when he is struggling with the development of number, which he begins to elaborate all sorts of ideas about numbers, until at last he develops complex superstitions about perfect numbers and imperfect numbers, about threes and sevens and the like. The same is the case with abstracted forms, and even today we are scarcely more than heads out of the vast subtle muddle of thinking about spheres and ideally perfect forms and so on. That was the price of this little necessary step to clear thinking. You know better than I do how large a part numerical and geometrical magic, numerical and geometrical philosophy has played in the history of the mind, and the whole apparatus of language and mental communication is beset with like dangers. The language of a savage is, I suppose, purely positive. The thing has a name. The name has a thing. This indeed is the tradition of language, and today even, we, when we hear a name, are predisposed, and sometimes it is a very vicious disposition, to imagine forthwith something answering to the name. We are disposed, as an incurable mental vice, to accumulate intention in terms. If I say to you Wadget or Crump, you find yourself passing over the fact that these are nothings, these are, so to speak, mere blankety-blanks, and trying to think what sort of things a Wadget or a Crump may be. And where this disposition has come in its most alluring guise, is in the case of negative terms. Our instrument of knowledge persists in handling even such openly negative terms as the absolute, the infinite, as though they were real existences. And when the negative element is ever so little disguised, as it is in such a word as omniscience, then the illusion of positive reality may be complete. Please remember that I am trying to tell you my philosophy and not arguing about yours. Let me try and express how in my mind this matter of negative terms has shaped itself. I think of something which I may perhaps best describe as being off the stage or out of court, or as the void without implications, or as nothingness, or as outer darkness. This is a sort of hypothetical beyond to the visible world of human thought, and thither I think all negative terms reach at last, and merge, and become nothing. Whatever positive class you make, whatever boundary you draw, straight away from that boundary begins the corresponding negative class, and passes into the illimitable horizon of nothingness. You talk of pink things. You ignore, if you are a trained logician, the more elusive shades of pink, and draw your line. Beyond is not the pink, known and knowable, and still in that not pink region one comes to the outer darkness, not blue, not happy, not iron, all the not classes meet in the outer darkness. The same outer darkness and nothingness is infinite space, and infinite time, and any being of infinite qualities, and all that region I rule out of court in my philosophy altogether. I will neither affirm nor deny, if I can help it, about any not things. I will not deal with not things at all, except by accident and inadvertence. If I use the word infinite, I use it as one often uses countless, the countless host of the enemy, or the immeasurable cliffs. That is to say, as the limit of measurement rather than as the limit of imaginary measurability, as a convenient equivalent to as many times this cloth yard as you can, and as many again, and so on, and so on. Now a great number of apparently positive terms are, or have become, practically negative terms and are under the same ban with me. A considerable number of terms that have played a great part in the world of thought seem to me to be invalidated by this same defect. To have no content, or an undefined content, or an unjustifiable content, for example the word omniscient, as implying an infinite knowledge, impresses me as being a word with a delusive air of being solid and full, when it is really hollow with no content whatever. I am persuaded that knowing is the relation of a conscious being to something not itself, that the thing known is defined as a system of parts and aspects and relationships, that knowledge is comprehension, and so that only finite things can know or be known. When you talk of a being of infinite extension and infinite duration, omniscient and omnipotent and perfect, you seem to me to be talking in negatives of nothing whatever. When you speak of the absolute, you speak to me of nothing. If, however, you talk of a great yet finite thinkable being, a being not myself, extending beyond my imagination in time and space, knowing all that I can think of as known and capable of doing all that I can think of as done, you come into a sphere of my mental operations and into the scheme of my philosophy. These, then, are my first two charges against our instrument of knowledge. Firstly, that it can work only by disregarding individuality and treating uniques as identically similar objects in this respect or that, so as to group them under one term, and that once it has done so it tends automatically to intensify the significance of that term, and secondly, that it can only deal freely with negative terms by treating them as though they were positive. But I have a further objection to the instrument of human thought, that it is not correlated to these former objections, and that it is also rather more difficult to convey. Essentially, this idea is to present a sort of stratification in human ideas. I have it very much in mind that various terms in our reasoning lie, as it were, at different levels and in different planes, and that we accomplish a large amount of error and confusion by reasoning terms together that do not lie or nearly lie in the same plane. Let me endeavor to make myself a little less obscure by a most flagrant instance from physical things. Suppose someone began to talk seriously of a man seeing an atom through a microscope, or perhaps of cutting one in half with a knife. There are a number of non-analytical people who would be quite prepared to believe that an atom could be visible to the eye or cut in this manner. But anyone at all conversant with the physical conceptions would almost as soon think of killing the square root of 2 with a rook rifle as of cutting an atom in half with a knife. Our conception of an atom is reached through a process of hypothesis and analysis, and in a world of atoms there are no knives and no men to cut. If you have thought with a strong consistent mental movement, then you have thought of your atom under the knife blade. Your knife blade has itself become a cloud of swinging grouped atoms, and your microscope lens a little universe of oscillatory and vibratory molecules. If you think of the universe, thinking at the level of atoms, there is neither knife to cut, scale to weigh, nor eye to see. The universe at that plane to which the mind of the molecular physicist descends has none of the shapes or forms of our common life whatever. This hand with which I write is in the universe of molecular physics a cloud of warring atoms and molecules, combining and recombining, colliding, rotating, flying hither and thither in the universal atmosphere of ether. You see, I hope what I mean when I say that the universe of molecular physics is at a different level from the universe of common experience. What we call stable and solid is in that world a freely moving system of interlacing centers of force. What we call color and sound is there no more than this length of vibration or that. We have reached to a conception of that universe of molecular physics by a great enterprise of organized analysis, and our universe of daily experiences stands in relation to that elemental world as if it were a synthesis of those elemental things. I would suggest to you that this is only a very extreme instance of the general state of affairs, that there may be finer and subtler differences of level between one term and another, and that terms may very well be thought of as lying obliquely and as being twisted through different levels. It will perhaps give a clearer idea of what I am seeking to convey if I suggest a concrete image for the whole world of man's thought and knowledge. Imagine a large clear jelly, in which at all angles and in all states of simplicity or contortion his ideas are embedded. They are all valid and possible ideas as they lie, none in reality incompatible with any. If you imagine the direction of up or down in this clear jelly being as it were the direction in which one moves by analysis or by synthesis, if you go down, for example, from matter to atoms and centers of force and up to men and states and countries, if you will imagine the ideas lying in that matter, you will get the beginning of my intention. But our instrument, our process of thinking, like a drawing before the discovery of perspective, appears to have difficulties with the third dimension, appears capable only of dealing with the reasoning about ideas by projecting them upon the same plane. It will be obvious that a great multitude of things may very well exist together in a solid jelly, which would be overlapping and incompatible and mutually destructive when projected together upon one plane. Through the bias in our instrument to do this, through reasoning between terms not in the same plane, an enormous amount of confusion, perplexity, and mental deadlocking occurs. The old theological deadlock between predestination and free will serves admirably as an example of the sort of deadlock I mean. Take life at the level of common sensation and common experience, and there is no more indisputable fact than man's freedom of will, unless it is his complete moral responsibility. But make only the least penetrating analysis and you perceive a world of inevitable consequences, a rigid succession of cause and effect. Insist upon a flat agreement between the two, and there you are. The instrument fails. It is upon these three objections, and upon an extreme suspicion of abstract terms which arise materially out of my first and second objections, that I chiefly rest my case for a profound skepticism of the remoter possibilities of the instrument of thought. It is a thing no more perfect than the human eye or the human ear, though like those other instruments it may have undefined possibilities of evolution towards increased range and increased power. So much for my main contention. But before I conclude, I may, since I am here, say a little more in the autobiographical vein, and with a view to your discussion to show how I reconcile this fundamental skepticism with the very positive beliefs about worldwide issues I possess, and with very definite distinction I make between right and wrong. I reconcile these things by simply pointing out to you that if there is any validity in my image of that three-dimensional jelly in which our ideas are suspended, such a reconciliation as you demand in logic, such a projection of the things as in accordance upon one plane, is totally unnecessary and impossible. This insistence upon the element of uniqueness in being, this subordination of the class to the individual difference, not only destroys the universal claim of philosophy, but the universal claim of ethical imperatives, the universal claim of any religious teaching. If you press me back upon my fundamental position, I must confess I put faith and standards and rules of conduct upon exactly the same level as I put my belief of what is right in art and what I consider right practice in art. I have arrived at a certain sort of self-knowledge, and there are, I find, very distinct imperatives for me. But I am quite prepared to admit there is no proving them imperative as anyone else. One's political proceedings, one's moral acts are, I hold, just as much self-expression as one's poetry or painting or music. But since life has for its primordial elements assimilation and aggression, I try not only to obey my imperatives, but to put them pervasively and convincingly into other minds, to bring about my good and to resist and overcome my evil, as though they were the universal good and the universal evil in which unthinking men believe. And it is obviously in no way contradictory to this philosophy, for me, if I find others responding sympathetically to any notes of mine, or if I find myself responding sympathetically to notes sounding about me. to give that common resemblance between myself and others a name, to refer these others and myself in common to this thing as if it were externalized and spanned us all. Scepticism of the instrument is, for example, not incompatible with religious association and with organization upon the basis of a common faith. It is possible to regard God as a being synthetic in relation to men and societies, just as the idea of a universe of atoms and molecules and inorganic relationships is analytical in relation to human life. The repudiation of demonstration in any but immediate and verifiable cases that this skepticism of the instrument amounts to, the abandonment of any universal validity for moral and religious propositions, brings ethical, social, and religious teaching into the province of poetry, and does something to correct the estrangement between knowledge and beauty that is a feature of so much mental existence at this time. All these things are self-expression. Such an opinion sets a new and greater value on the penetrating and illuminating quality of mind we call insight. Insight which, when it faces towards the contradictions that arise out of the imperfections of the mental instrument, is called humor. In these innate, unteachable qualities I hold, in humor and the sense of beauty, lies such hope of intellectual salvation from the original sin of the intellectual instrument as we may entertain in this uncertain and fluctuating world of unique appearances. So frankly I spread my little equipment of fundamental assumptions before you, heartily glad of the opportunity you have given me of taking them out, of looking at them with the particularity the presence of hearers ensues, and of hearing the impression they make upon you. Of course such a sketch must have an inevitable crudity of effect. The time I had for it, I mean the time I was able to give in preparation, was altogether too limited for an exhaustive finish of presentation. But I think on the whole I have got the main lines of this sketch map of my mental basis true. Whether I have made myself comprehensible is a different question altogether. It is for you, rather than me, to say how this sketch map of mine lies with regard to your own systematic cartography. Here followed certain comments upon personal idealism and Mr. F.C.S. Schiller's humanism of no particular value. End of Appendix. Recording by CalmDragon.net. End of A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells.